Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, Soul Society, Part 3. In a forested region just outside of the Siridi's walls, strong winds beat back against her hair. Glossy jade-like strands matting against the sweat of her brow. A bruise had formed on her chest, the redness spreading across her stomach. Over the rest of her body were numerous butterfly-like patterns. Neliel Tuadalschwank lowered her lance from its position, blocking her face, her body motionless aside from this one action. "What's wrong, Hollow?" Yuryuki goaded, skidding to halt along the ground. "Tired?" Not too far off, so iPhone followed suit, the agitation in her eyes clear as she looked first at Neliel, and then to Yuryuki. Nell snorted after hearing Yuryuki's question. She pointed her lance forward. "Coming from a 2vs1, you are not in a position to judge," Nell spoke, taking a moment to adjust her breathing. The situation had become increasingly troublesome after Yuryuki's intervention. It was simply because her two opponents were so well coordinated that it didn't make sense unless they've worked with each other before. However, from the fury in iPhone's eyes, she and Yuryuki did not appear to be on friendly terms. This is what confused Nell for the moment. However, she would loathe to be caught up in such an irrelevant matter. The most important aspect of the situation was how to counter the sudden two-way attack. First, she was already wary about the purpose of the black butterfly patterns forming across her body, and secondly, she had to find a way to deal with her enemy's speed. The surrounding trees and shrubs only made things even harder, obscuring visibility and allowing the enemy to suddenly shift positions by using the plants as springboards. It had become troublesome when she had to aim her lance. The area was not suited for her style of battle, therefore there was only a single thing she could do. Without warning, a pink cirrus began forming over her mouth, the spiritual pressure it was emitting enough of an indication to Yuryuki and iPhone of the power it possessed within it. iPhone, Yuryuki sent a nod towards the captain of the 2nd Division. iPhone clicked her tongue, but she understood what the past captain of the Stealth Corps was implying. She would be a blubbering fool unfit for her position if she hadn't. Quickly, Yuryuki and iPhone retreated several steps back, each bound large enough to cross tens of meters. Nell didn't care about iPhone and Yuryuki's evasive maneuvers as the two disappeared to hide amongst the trees. After all, Nell thought derisively, her cirrus was not aimed at them. With a quick motion, she turned her attack towards the ground and compressed it with even more spiritual energy before releasing it. Boom! The resulting shockwave sent a plume of ash and debris into the air, and reduced the surroundings to acres of splintered wood and burnt leaves. The battleground was now an open plain similar to the environment fought within Hueco Mundo's large dunes. As the dust and dirt continued to hail from the sky, Nell watched passively as two pairs of hands breached through the forest's remains seeking leverage before the main body burst out. Yuryuki and iPhone were dirty, their clothes torn and stained with soil, but fortunately, they didn't sustain much injury aside from a trickle of blood that seeped from a cut on iPhone's forehead. Nell beckoned the two forward. Before they already had the advantage in numbers, and they still did, but her advantage was in her strength as a Vasto Lord. One or two good hits should be enough to render one immobile to deliver a killing blow. Now that the terrain was neutralized, her chances of landing said blows had increased. Yet for some reason, the two didn't attack immediately. Instead, iPhone stood rooted as she stared past Nell's back in disbelief. That's impossible," iPhone muttered aloud. Nell didn't have to turn around to know what iPhone was looking at. After all, when she destroyed the surrounding trees, visibility had greatly increased, allowing them all to see the state of the Siridi. When iPhone had first been pursed, she had already stopped the initial hail of spears from penetrating through the Siridi's defenses and had even alerted the other captains of the problem. This should have been enough of a contingency to allow the head captain or other captains to come up with a measure to prevent the Hollow's entry. Yet, the Hollows had all made it into the Siridi. From where the three stood, smoke was billowing up from the Siridi behind Nell's back in full view of the other two. Shiro had done it, Nell thought quietly to herself. Of course, she had no doubts with his capabilities. To protect his own domain and followers for so long, the Hollow was sure to be all-powerful in his own right. It was an error on the Soul Society's part to provoke such an individual. Nell readied her spear, her instincts telling her that the enemy was about to unleash their power in a frenzy. So iPhone's eyes narrowed dangerously. She couldn't afford to waste any more time with the situation the Siridi was in. Briefly, she turned her attention towards Yoryuki and couldn't help the bout of anger that nearly overwhelmed her earlier. Yoryuki had left So iPhone without a word in the past, leaving So iPhone to pick up command of the 2nd Division and Stealth Corps Yoryuki had left behind. The resentment due to that event was not small. But for the sake of the Siridi, So iPhone could put her past injustices and grudges on hold until after the danger has subsided. Seeing the resolution in So iPhone's eyes, Yoryuki dashed forward to initiate the attack. Nell's sense moved into overdrive. It was unquestionable to her about which of her opponent's speed was faster. Over the course of Yoryuki's interference in the battle, the one that had caused the most damage to Nell was Yoryuki. The bruises left on Nell's body were enough of an indication. So iPhone on the other hand, did her little damage, but from the amount of butterfly patterns sprouting on top of her skin, Nell was sure that So iPhone had her own methods to kill. TCH. Nell's lips thinned as she gritted her teeth from the sudden blow to her abdominals. Ignoring the pain, she lashed out with her lance, only to falter midway when she heard a whistling by her ear. Twisting her body, she barely managed to dodge the finger strike aimed at her neck. Hoof planting against the ground, she pushed forward, using her superior build and strength to tower over Yoryuki. Her left arm propped itself up, her body maneuvering to stand on her hind legs. Power welled up from within her. Beast-like, and domineering. It was a stance reminiscent of the Greek centaur of legend. A teacher, healer, and prophet. The bowman and trainer of heroes. Chiron. Lanzader Verde. It was an instant in time. As Nell's eyes locked onto Yoryuki's figure, she could see the ripples moving across Yoryuki's muscles as the woman immediately attempted to move out of strike range. She wouldn't let her. In a battle between sudden bursts of speeds, she was confident in her own swiftness. Like a leopard giving chase to an animal mere meters in front of it. There was no escape. Ah! The gasp couldn't help but come out of her mouth. It was completely unexpected. Why was Yoryuki smiling? Unable to find an answer, and unwilling to cease her attack, the outcome was not in her favor. Shunko, Yoryuki spoke calmly, twisting her body to reveal that she hadn't had the intention of escaping Nell's strike at all. Rather, she would meet it with her own. Lightning-like tendrils scorched the earth, bright pressurized Kido spewing like torrents from out of Yoryuki's back and sleeves, giving her the appearance of wings. From the danger she was feeling, Nell knew that the situation was no longer in her favor. And it played out just as she had expected when Yoryuki burst forward with her attack. Thunder King's fists. Nell's expression stiffened. Like snakes, Yoryuki's hands seemed to ignore the power contained within Nell's lance, and instead battered ceaselessly against the arm holding it. CRKK-. Nell muffled a scream as the bone of her left arm snapped. The direction of her attack was altered as a result, heavily cratering the ground. This result however allowed Nell to destabilize Yoryuki's footing. Capitalizing on the opportunity, she immediately punched out with her right fist. Yoryuki had crossed her arms to block, yet it still resulted in her being blown back and sustaining damage. Large bruises that quickly blackened appeared across the entirety of both of her arms. However, Nell was the one that was worse off. After all, she wasn't facing just one opponent. With her left arm temporarily out of use, Nell felt a sense of helplessness take root from within her as So iPhone appeared on her weakened side. Nell cursed inwardly, attempting to dodge as she had no means to use her left arm to block her left side. Due to her size though, she was unable to dodge, and instead, was forced to take a gamble. Suzumibuki pierced into one of the butterflies on Nell's body a second time. Afterwards, So iPhone quickly retreated. It's over, So iPhone spoke calmly as Nell glared. You may have been curious about those marks appearing on your body during this entire fight, So iPhone spoke, her Zanpakuto returning to its Nodaki form. I can tell you though that no matter how strong you are, you're dead. Suzumibuki had a deadly ability. It was called death in 2 steps. If struck in the same spot which was hit the first time, Suzumibuki's victim will inevitably die. This was all but guaranteed, and with this knowledge, So iPhone was extremely confident in her kill. Not even glancing back at a glaring Nell, So iPhone headed in the direction of the Siriti, Yoryuki following behind her. Left behind, Nell felt exhausted, but felt extremely lucky for her quick thinking. On her body, on a certain butterfly mark, her hollow bone armor shattered into numerous pieces, revealing the smooth and unblemished tan skin beneath. This was the spot that So iPhone had stabbed a second time. By focusing all of her spiritual energy at that one spot she predicted So iPhone would hit, she created several dense layers of extra protection on the area. Yet it was tantamount to the puncturing strength of Suzumibuki that all layers had been pierced, the bone armor shattering into pieces. If what So iPhone had said was correct, then Nell really would have had died should the second strike had actually landed. A shiver ran down her back, but she was far from scared. As a hollow, this wasn't the first time that she was near death. Still, her body ached, and blood oozed out from the other puncture marks over her skin. Worse still, the various bruises made it hard to move and gather energy. She had no choice but to seek shelter within the distant forests her previous attack didn't destroy and recuperate there. Tentatively, she made her way under cover despite the pain of her movements. Eventually, she collapsed, sitting down on her side and leaning her back against a tree. Her expression displayed her frustration. Individually, she had 100% confidence in defeating her opponent, but against two enemies both specializing in speed above her own. The battle was exceedingly difficult. Still, she was smart as Vasto Lord, and thought back to her mistakes. The next time if she were to run into the two again, it would not be her hiding away to recuperate. Grimacing at her injuries, her eyes expressed the displeasure of what she was about to do. She was a Vasto Lord, and the prestige such a title brought to a hollow was not something to be looked down upon. As the strongest of hollows in hierarchy, her power was gigantic, but there was once a time when it wasn't so, back when she was still an Aegis roaming around Hueco Mundo. This was at a time when she hadn't met with her companions like Pesha. Not that she would have had been strong enough to protect them at the time, but it was better that way. Only with strength could one do what one wishes. The weak must find their own way to power. This was true for all Vasto Lord roaming within Hueco Mundo. Similarly, those kinds of hollows are in possession of a certain skill or advantage when seeking and fighting prey. She was much the same. Although she possessed high-speed regeneration like many hollows at the Aegis stage in evolution, high-speed regeneration was incredibly taxing to undergo. Even just regenerating an arm could take a fourth of her reserves. Therefore, what she had that other Aegis didn't in their fight for survival, was another means to heal from her injuries with minor spiritual energy if at all. This was what allowed her to stand above the rest. That, and her ability to absorb an enemy hollow's Zero and send it right back at them with increased power and speed. She hated her healing method. Made her look like a fool even. Yet with the situation as it was now, her wounds stinging and blood seeping out, it reminded her of those near life and death situations of the past. At those times, she couldn't have cared less about any personal feelings, and she wouldn't care about it now. Granted, she did get some respite knowing that there was no other hollow or Shinigami in the area to see her. Still, her expression grew increasingly cold as she thought of So iPhone and Yoryuki as feeling once again began to course through her broken left arm. In which point, her arm began to move. Slowly and stiffly, she reached a hand into her mouth and over her teeth towards her throat. The sound of choked gagging echoed within the stillness of the forest, her wounds gradually healing. Elsewhere, Ichigo could hardly believe the sight before his eyes. He and his group were completely surrounded by hollows whose strength was nothing to laugh about. Even worse, there were Vasto Lord-class hollows mixed in with the crowd. However, these hollows had not attacked them at all. Instead, they were just standing there in confusion, equally as stupefied as himself as the attention of everyone's gazes focused on the little childlike hollow. It was Lilynet Gingerbuck, the hollow he had met in Karakura town. Currently, she was staring directly at him, her finger still outstretched and pointing at him after her previous outburst. Subsequently, everyone turned to face him. Kyokaku, Ganju, and the rest aside from Ishida were also staring at him in befuddlement. After all, they weren't there to witness the scene of Lilynet's arrival unlike Ishida and himself. Closing her mouth, Lilynet then turned to face the other hollows. What are you all waiting for, you idiots? She spoke. Get away from M. Lilynette pushed herself through the crowd, dragging along a wavy brown-haired man who looked as if he'd rather be anywhere but his current location. This man was named as Star K when Lilynette grew irritated and started berating him. Meanwhile, Ichigo was still in a stupor in which he was knocked out from when Lilynette appeared directly in front of him. What are you doing here? She asked haughtily, her hands on her hips as she leaned forward questioningly. He didn't know how to answer for a moment. It was rather hard for him to take Lilynette seriously when she barely even reached half his size, and was still acting superior. Perhaps Lilynette noticed the incredulous yet amused look on his face as she then climbed onto Star K's back and began questioning again from a higher position. What are you doing here? She asked again, this time her arms were crossed and she was looking down on him. She completely ignored Star K's protests. Looking at the scene, a twitch of irritation appeared on his lip as he considered giving a lesson to the brat. But seeing the hollows still around him and his friends, he suppressed the urge. What was even more of a shock for him was that Lilynette commanded such respect from the other hollows. Looking at it now, the invading hollows were under Lilynette's control. The idea was absurd, but facts proved louder than words. Even then, under Lilynette's stare, he decided based on the experiences he had with her in the human world that she was trustworthy enough. Otherwise, he could probably bribe her with the ice cream she had once tasted in Karakura town. We're here to rescue people, he said clearly after a moment. Lilynette's eyes widened. Oh. We are too, she spoke as if competing. As this was going on, he felt a nudge on his side. How the hell do you know these hollows? Kyokaku whispered discreetly. He could only smile bitterly. There wasn't enough time to explain, and even less when one of the other Vasto Lords appeared followed by more. Oh yeah brat, why'd you tell everyone to stop attacking? Emilu Apasai said. Behind Apasai were Sung-sun and Mila Rose who had the same questioning appearance. Lilynette grunted. They're friends, she said, using Star K as a shield. Friends. Apasai echoed, looking at Ichigo and the rest's direction. 3 of them feel like Shinigami, and the rest are just humans. How could they possibly be friends? Look, one of them even looks like a Shinigami. It's better to just kill them. Apasai stepped forward. No. Lilynette said, jumping off of Star K to stand in front of Ichigo and the rest. I agree with you about the others, but Ichigo's a good guy, Lilynette said with a nod. Apasai's mouth twitched and she considered just pushing Lilynette aside. However, one glance at Star K and remembering the strength Star K had once displayed, she quickly decided against it. Clicking her tongue, Apasai conceded the issue grumpily. Where are you guys going? Lilynette asked Ichigo once the hollows around began to give them space. Leaving behind only herself, Star K, Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung-sun at the center. Ichigo didn't have the chance to answer though. It was Kyokaku instead. The isolation tower, Kyokaku said. She had thought about it quite deeply. There was nothing to hide from these hollows as none of them aside from Lilynette looked like they cared about the information. And if they did, didn't that mean they'd have the help of Vasto Lord class hollows? It's where the Soul Society keeps its prisoners and individuals of high profile. Hearing those words, not only Lilynette, but Sung-sun and the others' eyes widened. Sung-sun and the rest of the Hollow's objective was to find Silent, and perhaps she could be in the isolation tower that was spoken of. For Apasai and the rest, it was a good lead to go on. Previously, she, Mila Rose, and Sung-sun had been combating against a few other captain-class Shinigami, but for some reason unknown to them, their opponents suddenly left acting as if they were still fighting someone. Bewildered at the time, Apasai and the others did nothing as they watched their opponents disappear into the distance towards another part of the Siridi. They hadn't pursued, and this fact was mainly because of Sung-sun who quickly reminded them what Lady Haribel had instructed beforehand. There was no point in wasting their energy on a battle that was meaningless. Instead, they would direct their effort towards locating Silent like as Haribel had instructed. This isolation tower, which direction is it? Sung-sun asked gruffly, a hand to her mouth as if disdain speaking to those she considered below her. Kyokaku stared at Sung-sun, and thought over her answer, not caring about Sung-sun's rude gesture. "It's over there," she spoke eventually, pointing at the distant buildings. "However, if you are thinking of heading there now, you're bound to fail. It's heavily fortified as it's near the 4th Squad's barracks where the majority of injured Shinigami are sent to heal from their injuries. Furthermore, the location is also near other key buildings that allow for quick deployment of troops. Undoubtedly, you will face a lot of opposition." Sung Sun closed her mouth, and bit back any response she was about to say. Kyokaku's answer was precise enough for her to get a general understanding of the situation. Furthermore, out of 3 female Vasto Lords present, she was undoubtedly the smartest. She could read subtleties and the undertones in Kyokaku's voice well enough to understand something. "Then you would have a way?" Sung Sun inquired, staring at Kyokaku. Instead of answering, Kyokaku just began to walk off. This action was enough of an answer. Ichigo and the others hesitated for a moment, but then quickly followed after Kyokaku along with Mila Rose and the rest. Lilinette separated from Stark and moved towards Ichigo, the two soon beginning to argue about matters Stark could care less about. Instead, Stark's eyes trailed towards Apasai and the rest following after Kyokaku. He knew that the three thought that Silent may be in the isolation tower Kyokaku had spoken of, but the odds weren't 100% either. Therefore, Stark decided on a course of action despite the relative laziness he displayed while doing so. He quickly instructed the other Ajichas level hollows to disperse back in different direction of the Siriti. In this way, they may be able to find Silent sooner. Besides, no matter if Kyokaku had a method to get to the isolation tower or not, it would have been impossible not to get spotted with a group of hollows as large as theirs. Therefore, Stark had instructed them to disperse. The group of several dozen hollows thinned down to just Stark, Lilinette, Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose. If Kyokaku and the rest took heed of this, they didn't show it on their faces. As Stark and the others walked leisurely after Kyokaku's lead, they missed one of the hollows Shiro had sent to tell everyone to gather together. Walking silently, this odd group of Shinigami, humans, and hollows made their way towards a certain area of the Siriti. Suddenly, Kyokaku stopped. In front of her was a single path that led up to a flight of stairs connecting up to a larger platform. Said platform had a massive cylindrical tower stretching out into the sky. If one were to look carefully, it was possible to see numerous groups of Shinigami organizing themselves nearby in the other locations adjacent. The path Kyokaku had taken was roundabout, and she had even led them through a great majority of the way through the Soul Society's underground system. Just remembering the smell nearly caused Lilinette to gag, but nonetheless, they'd made their way to the tower with minimal detection if at all. The rampant spiritual energies in the air helped to mask them even further after they had suppressed their spiritual energy. However, the group's sudden stop caused question marks to appear in everyone's minds. However, the answer became apparent after looking at the base of the staircase. "Renji." Ichigo spoke, seeing the Shinigami he had fought in the human world. The current situation was the fact that Renji was blocking the way. With Renji at the base of the flight of stairs, it became impossible to avoid detection up to this point, and Kyokaku knew it. However, Kyokaku forgot that in the group she was leading, 3 of them were rash and hot-headed, even excluding Ichigo and Karen. "It's only one Shinigami," Mila Rose spoke, pushing forward along with Apasai. It looked as if they were having a competition as to who would defeat Renji first. However, the two were stopped by Sung Sun. "You idiots," Sung Sun reprimanded. "There's no point in squabbling over a weakling. How unrefined of you two. How could the two of you even hope to be in Lady Haribel, or Shiro's good graces? It's too comical." "Bitch, shut up," Apasai and Mila Rose swore, redirecting their attention. Meanwhile, Lilinette was already urging Stark to take action, pounding on his back to get him to move forward. However, it was doomed to be a failed attempt. Stark would not budge for a reason so trivial. Instead, it was Ichigo who confronted Renji despite Kyokaku's hisses for him to remain where he was. Ichigo couldn't do as Kyokaku said though. Between Renji and himself, the two had many things to settle. Past scores, and setting things straight. In his opinion, if Renji cared so much for Rukia, then why didn't Renji devote his strength into saving her rather than condemning her to death? It wasn't right. As Ichigo approached, he quickly noticed that Renji had already taken notice of them. It was hard not to when he considered the sheer presence of the Vasto Lords behind him, especially when Apasai and Mila Rose had released their spiritual energy moments earlier. However, a look of surprise appeared over Renji's face, followed by a wave of contempt and fury as he noticed Ichigo. "It's you," Renji spoke through gritted teeth. His Zanpakuto was immediately drawn. "If it weren't for you, Rukia wouldn't be in this situation." Ichigo had no answer other than to draw out his own sword. It was then that Renji noticed the others. Hollows, Vasto Lord. Renji's tone of voice was incredulous and filled with a disbelief carrying a hint of fear. Even more so when he recalled that his captain had been defeated by Vasto Lords previously. It was only recently that Captain Byakuya woke up, and the man had already disappeared from the medical ward despite his injuries. "You led Hollows here," Renji said gravely. However, Renji didn't move to inform the others immediately. Renji was hot-headed, but he was in no way a fool. If Ichigo was traveling with Hollows, then that meant that they must have shared the same objective. Were the Vasto Lords helping Ichigo to rescue Rukia? It was the only objective he could conclude that Ichigo would have in the Sirei. Renji's emotions immediately became conflicted. On one hand, he knew that the chances of succeeding in rescuing Rukia would increase with the battle strength of several Vasto Lords, but he also had his duty as a Shinigami. Eventually, he settled on an answer, keeping the entirety of his attention on Ichigo. Perhaps Kyukaku derived, or understood something from the situation, but she immediately began leading the others past Renji, who did nothing to stop them. Orium, Karin, Chad, and Ishida faltered at that moment, unsure about what to do, but Ichigo quickly gave them a nod to move forward. This was his battle to face. As soon as Kyukaku and the rest were out of sight, Ichigo opened his mouth to speak. "Why'd you let them go?" he asked, although he already had a hunch. "That's none of your business," Renji dismissed. Renji's dismissal only strengthened the theory growing in Ichigo's mind, but regardless, this wasn't the time. With a single step, the battle began with a single shout. "Hell, Zabumaru!" In the buildings above, Lilynet and Starkey stared down as the battle began. Instead of following after Kyukaku and the rest, Lilynet had unexpectedly decided to wait and see how Ichigo's battle would conclude. "Lilynet, you don't want to follow?" Starkey asked, making himself comfortable. Lilynet balled her hands into fists. "I do want to follow, but..." She trailed off. For some reason, she felt that it would be a shame if Ichigo were to unfortunately die. In the time she had spent with him in Karakura Town, she had seen and experienced the kind of person he was. Even if she was a hollow, he didn't treat her with any contempt or prejudice. Instead, when she had explained that she was looking for someone in Karakura Town, Ichigo had even toured her around along with another black-haired Shinigami. Rukia, if she could recall. Because of these experiences, there was a part within herself that considered Ichigo a friend. In which case, letting him die as she went forward left a bitter taste in her mouth. Thus, she had stayed behind, and wherever she would be, Starkey would follow too. In her opinion, Starkey was always the most dependable. Back when they were alone, they only had each other. Now she had many friends. And she would keep it that way. She didn't want to experience that feeling of loneliness again, making her hold those close to her dear. Perhaps on some levels, Starkey understood what she was thinking, as even though Starkey appeared to be slacking, his eyes were on the battle unblinking. With just a word from her, she was sure that Starkey would intervene. "Let's go," Kyukaku spoke, urging Orium and the others to get a move on. The isolation tower was directly ahead of them, and there was no point in looking back now like Orium and the others were doing. Kyukaku knew the reason though, and it was precisely because of this that she couldn't put any anger in her tone. They were just concerned about Ichigo. However, unlike them who wasn't paying attention, Kyukaku long ago noticed that Starkey and Linet had stayed behind. If those two were helping him, then Ichigo should be safe. Turning her attention towards the isolation tower, she realized that it would be a long climb to reach the top. The only way to enter the tower was through an adjacent building connected by wooden bridge. Said building was surrounded by a large flight of stairs that spiraled around it to reach the top. Looking back at the worried face of Orium and the others, Kyukaku decided that she would continue leading this inexperienced group. Follow me, she said, moving forward. Apasai, Sung-sun, and Mila Rose didn't follow after Kyokaku and the others. Instead, the three were looking at the tower and then to the flight of stairs. It would be way faster if we just jumped up, Mila Rose quickly concluded. For once, no argued with her amongst the three. We're not going to follow them. Apasai asked dismissively. There's no point now that we're here, Sung-sun said. On this point, the three of them were once again in sync. They held no attachments to Kyokaku and the rest, only curiosity towards Ichigo, and Ichigo wasn't present at the moment. Speaking of which, where's the brat? Apasai asked. She had been sure Lilynet and Stark were following from behind. And from the looks of it, Mila Rose was of the same mind. They stayed behind if the two of you didn't notice, Sung-sun spoke sighing. You both still have to work on your observation skills. Neither Apasai or Mila Rose could retort. After all, they had failed to notice Stark and Lilynet leave in their haste. What do you guys think the brat finds interesting in that orange-haired Shinigami? Mila Rose asked. It's Ichigo if you can't recall, and unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that question, Sung-sun replied. With everything settled out though, well then, shall we? Apasai and Mila Rose nodded. Spiritual energy gathering to their legs, the three soon cratering the ground as they leapt up, creating cracks that spread out to become small fissures. The tower was huge, reaching an absurd distance into the sky. Even for Sung-sun and the others, it was impossible to make it to the top in a single bound. Therefore, they all moved towards the tower's base to use it as leverage for another strong leap up. However, as soon as Apasai's foot made contact with the building, instead of being able to leap further up as she intended, she instead felt her power suddenly vanish. Subsequently, she began falling down, crashing into the ground where she left an imprint on the polished tile. Mila Rose and Sung-sun burst out into laughter, Sung-sun's laugh more reserved as she used a hand to cover her mouth. Idiot, can't even jump properly, Mila Rose goaded. Like Apasai, she was nearing the maximum height of her leap and would need to take another one using the tower. This is how it's done, Mila Rose spoke, staring down at Apasai as her foot made contact with the building's ledge. Mila Rose looked down on her foot stupidly, and then wordlessly crashed down into the ground as she experienced a similar loss of power as Apasai. Who's the fool now? Apasai relished in Mila Rose's failure. Shut up, Mila Rose spoke, pushing herself off the ground. There's something weird with this tower. As Sung-sun was nearing the apex of her leap, she hesitated as she glanced down at the two below. They were staring expectantly at her. Admittedly, she didn't like the feeling. If 2 out of 3 didn't succeed, then what was the point of making a fool out of herself? There was no class in that at all, and the two down below were just waiting for her to fail. There was no way she would give them that pleasure. She coolly snorted, reaching the apex of her jump, and then slowly descending down. Apasai and Mila Rose felt a twitch on their faces as they stared at Sung-sun, who was looking condescendingly at them. Instead of saying anything, Sung-sun instead moved towards the tower and placed a hand on it, her expression growing dim. This tower has similar properties to the wall that surrounds the Siriti, making it hard to create a platform of energy beneath our feet or to concentrate our energy, Sung-sun concluded. It'll be far too difficult to utilize our power to make our way up by jumping. Therefore, our only choice is to walk up unless we can fly naturally. After Sung-sun finished speaking, the three of them looked toward the base of the stairs, and grudgingly began to make their way up to catch up to Kyokaku and the rest. Speaking of Kyokaku, she and the others had already made their way up the majority of the tower. In just a few more steps they would reach the wooden bridge leading into the isolation tower's holding room. She didn't speak much with the others, nor did she try to alleviate their concerns towards Ichigo, but that was because she had her own troubles to deal with at the moment. In just a matter of minutes, she would be able to confirm for herself the validity of Ichigo's past statement. In some part of her heart, she knew that this could have been a ploy to allow Ichigo and the others easy access into the Siriti, but she couldn't help but believe it anyway. After all, her elder brother may be alive. She swallowed just as she arrived at the top, the sound of footsteps behind her alerting her to the fact Ganju and the others had arrived beside her. She didn't that much notice though. Someone else had her attention. Well well, Lady Shiba, a man wearing a pink patterned kimono spoke. Said man was occupying a spot directly in front of the wooden bridge. It's been a long time since you've last visited the Siriti. And to think, you even brought friends. The man was obviously referring to Orium and the others, but there didn't seem to be any hostility in the man's tone. Captain Kyukaku said, clicking her tongue. I don't suppose you'd let me just take a look at who's in there, would you? Shunsui Kyuraku tilted the straw hat over his head down, casting a shadow over his eyes as he thought back to the final wishes of the lieutenant of the 13th Division. Ah, yes, about that, afraid not. Classified stuff there, yes, Shunsui drawled. However, he soon realized that his refusals were only making Kyukaku want to try harder to know what lay inside. Yet, Shunsui couldn't just give her permission to see either. Lady Shiba, I would much appreciate it if you didn't make things difficult for this lazy captain. Perhaps we can just share a drink or two instead. Cut the bullshit, Captain. Kyukaku roared. If you won't let me see, then why don't you just tell me who's in there? Shunsui released a sigh before he shook his head. It's classified information. Saying that, Shunsui seemed to detect something moments later as his eyes narrowed. Just as Kyukaku was about to burst into a rage, her expression shifted into one of panic. Ganju, get down. She called. Confused about why Kyukaku was telling him to get down, Ganju still did so anyway, avoiding a Zero that whizzed past with its trajectory aimed towards the door of the isolation tower. Almost in the blink of an eye, Shunsui had cut it in half with a drawn sword, destroying it before it could even reach. TCH, Mila Rose grunted in annoyance. She hadn't been aiming for Ganju, but the man had unfortunately positioned himself in the way after she had already let loose the attack. But in any case, she didn't really care. Vasto Lords, Shunsui's expression immediately became serious after he concluded his sightings. Oi, you sleazy-looking man. If you're busy dealing with the others, then why don't you just let us see who's in this tower without disrupting us? Sung Sun said. I can guarantee that we will leave if our target isn't there. Sleazy, me? Beautiful lady, do your eyes simply deceive you? Shunsui spoke back, readying his sword. No, my vision is far better when judging others, Sung Sun replied smoothly. Now either get out of the way, or prepare yourself for battle. You aren't making this easy for me, you know, Shunsui said. In fact, I'm afraid your two friends over there have already decided to make trouble for me. Hearing Shunsui's response, Sung Sun could only exasperatedly shake her head in annoyance at the provocative looks Apasai and Mila Rose were giving, their energy already shifting into a battle frenzy. They were idiots, no more than just idiots, they were imbeciles. Didn't they understand that everything would just become a waste of energy if Silent wasn't even inside the tower? It was far better to first verify before taking action, but these two. Sung Sun just had no words to express herself other than a vehement amount of insults. Without waiting for the conversation to continue, Apasai and Mila Rose struck out first, forcing Shunsui to retreat up into another part of the building where he faced off against the two. At the top of the tower, the influence of whatever property in the building was somewhat reduced, allowing for battle. Sung Sun stared at Kyukaku, and felt as if she was being used. However, she couldn't say anything as it was Apasai and Mila Rose who started everything. Grudgingly she followed after her two friends. Realizing the opportunity that was in front of her eyes, Kyukaku immediately moved towards the tower. Hurry, she beckoned Ganju and everyone else over. The bridge was wide and long, and by the time everyone reached the holding cell at the isolation tower, sounds of explosions began to ring from where Shunsui was confronting Apasai and the others. As she placed a hand on the door of the cell, her body couldn't help but freeze. This was the moment. Briefly, she recalled all the memories she had of that smiling older brother of hers. The last hope of the Shiba clan that was ruthlessly crushed and turned into bitter resentments. He had been killed. It was like a mantra that had once repeated in her young mind over and over again, and still did in her dreams. She had long since been informed of the situation, and she knew herself well enough to know that she never blamed Rukia Kukaki, the Shinigami involved in her brother's death. Yet that didn't stop her from grieving. It was like something had grabbed hold of her heart and was constantly squeezing it. At this moment, time felt as if it was frozen. And in this time frame, Ganju's hand brushed up against her own, and together they pushed open the prison cell. It was dark and cramped. The only light coming from a rectangular-shaped opening that acted as a window to allow air into the room. Other than that, the room was devoid of anything else, just a stone slab of Sekizeki rock that could be used to sit on. Aorium, Chad, Ishida, Karen. Rukia stood up in surprise within the room. She was wearing a white gown like kimono. An attire designated to souls that were to be purified and extinguished by the Sukyaku. She and Ganju didn't care much about this though. Instead, she didn't know when it began, but tears were streaming down her eyes. Her face shifted, her brows crinkling together as the sheer emotion running through her overwhelmed her. As strong of a woman as she was, she suddenly felt as if she had lost all her strength, returning to that little girl who waited foolishly for a brother that wouldn't return. She dropped to her knees, sobbing quietly, using the back of her hands to wipe away at the tears that just wouldn't stop. Ganju was much the same, yet instead of falling on his knees, he had covered his eyes with an arm, yet it was clear that the man was crying too from the transparent stream of liquid trailing down his cheeks. Orium and the others couldn't speak. Instead, they were staring in shock at the person who had garnered such a reaction. Ichigo? The person appeared like an exact copy of Ichigo aside from the black hair the man had. From what Ichigo had said before, this man was named Kyan Shiba, and he was the older brother of Kyokaku and Ganju. Kyan was staring in shock, a hint of something flashing across those expressive eyes. Startled to his feet, Kyan opened his mouth and asked gravely. Kei Kyokaku, Ji Ganju? What are you doing here? Chapter 22, Soul Society, Part 4. It felt as if the world was spinning around her, shifting and swimming and unable to form a concrete image. The act of opening her eyes alone made a sudden burst of nausea impact against her temples that nearly caused her to black out once again. Silent would not, however, as this time she had been quick to gather her depleted spiritual energy and force herself awake. It was dark, and based on the texture of the ground beneath her, she was in some sort of dim-lit cave. Stalagmites hung from the ceiling, dripping down tiny drops of liquid that made steady plopping noises in the stillness. Plop. Plop. They went. She didn't know how long she had been here, and even her memories were a tad jumbled from the moment she had acted on an impulse. It was like something had taken over her at that instant, an instinct that refused any kind of logical reasoning from taking any kind of role in decision-making. All that she knew was that she wouldn't let go of her enemy because of fear. Thinking about it, no, it wasn't because she was afraid of the enemy, but she was fearful of what that enemy would do if her hand had let go. It was strange. The notion of concerning herself for someone else's well-being as a hollow, or whatever she was. Then again, she definitely wasn't the first, as she already knew of one. She pressed down on her eyes in an attempt to ward off her throbbing migraine to no use. However, that didn't mean that she would just continue to remain where she was. Ichigo. Karen. Those names seemed to play like a record in her mind. Although she could match those names to the faces she had seen, somehow or another, she couldn't match them with any of her memories. This frustrated her to no end, but this wasn't the time to think about it. Her fingers twitched, slowly feeling out against the cold floor until they stopped just beneath her, grasping for a stable hold. Her mouth opened in reflex as the pain assailed her while she pushed up with her trembling arms. The noise of shuffling movements were the only sounds that echoed within the darkness, and even then, it went on for much too long as she eventually staggered onto her feet. Blinking her eyes, she looked towards the rays of light that pierced their way into the cave. Considering the deep black behind, the rays of light appeared to be her only exit. Supporting herself while leaning against a wall, she began to make her way there. All the while, she could feel it. Her spiritual energy was dwindling. She didn't know what had been done to her, or maybe it was just because of her surroundings, but she was finding it increasingly hard to replenish her spiritual energy. Normally, this process should have had been completed after a couple hours or days of rest, but judging from her tattered clothing and appearance, more than enough time should have had already passed. Still, she had recovered barely anything. What she had in reserve is what she would have to make do with, and this amount was only barely enough to force her awake and moving. HAAA. HAAA. One breath at a time, one step after another. It was increasingly difficult. When her legs were near collapsing, it was then that she reached the opening at the end of the path. Having followed the trail of that light, all she could make out at its opening was an aerial view of the Siriti. She wasn't surprised, as she had already considered that she would have had been taken to the Soul Society after she wasn't instantly killed. Then again, what was truly concerning her at the moment as her spiritual energy gradually depleted, was the ominous presence she now detected above her. Regal and unbending. The feeling described by hollows under a Shinigami's blade. Yet this feeling, it appeared as if there were thousands of them in a single sword. Nonetheless, she couldn't give up. Not when she saw something that caused an immediate guilt to well up from within her. She staggered on wobbly feet as she moved forward once more. Even if it were just a tiny step, she wouldn't allow herself to do nothing anymore. After all, she could see hollows fighting outside in her elevated view, and there could only be a single reason for such a thing. The oddest of all hollows, and the one she had first met upon awakening in Hueco Mundo. The Vasto of White. Her breath seemed to hitch as she realized the extent one hollow was willing to go for another. In that case. Aah! A silent shout. Willful and fleeting, but filled with the determination of a soul unwilling to be extinguished so easily. Her remaining spiritual force was like a beacon that shone in the misty harbor. Clear, and devoid of the general ferocity normally associated with other hollows, for she was different in a way. This was why she had quickly considered the risk, but still followed through with it anyway. Compared to the hollows attacking the Siriti, the sudden emergence of spiritual energy would probably not be prioritized too quickly. Her outburst of energy had to be distinct enough to be noticed. Hence, she was gathering it all up to release it in one burst. Though that burst may be small, it should be enough, for there were those who would recognize it for what it was. After all, it was her spiritual pressure, a marker and symbol that shouted out that she was alive. With this in mind, she continued to draw out the entirety of her reserves. I'm here. It was as if she was shouting this at the present moment, even if she was generally unable to. However, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you stop there, a deep and baritone voice filtered into her ears after a sharp pain struck her at the back of the neck. Thereafter, a heavy spiritual pressure suffocated and snuffed out her own before she even had a chance to let it all out. Who? This thought was the only word in her mind as she blacked out into unconsciousness. Starkey and Lilynet hadn't shown up yet. Then again, neither did Mila Rose, Sung Sun, or Apasai. In which case, just how far have they gotten to not receive word of grouping up? Shiro's brows furrowed in thought, and it wasn't because of the two children tugging at his face, rather, it was because of the fortifications he could see being made within his vision. Located several hundred meters out in the buildings of the Siriti, a plethora of Shinigami were bunched together in a tight defensive. A single old man stood standing at the forefront with his hands clasped over a wooden cane. These several hundred meters or so of gap was like a buffer zone between both parties where the threat of retaliation was left unspoken for whomever would step forward first. At this point, neither side was willing to do so as many of the hollows and Shinigami were still scattered. What will you do now? Ulquiorra asked curiously from the side. Has following this emotion to save others been of any use at all? His gaze momentarily left the battlefield and moved towards Ulquiorra. After deciding to gather up his forces, Ulquiorra was one of the first to arrive. This was due to his close proximity and the fact that the density of Ulquiorra's spiritual energy was quite high, making it difficult for other hollows to miss. About that Ulquiorra, Shiro began as he stood up on his feet after brushing off Sogyo no Kotori. Our purpose here isn't meant to have been of any use. Hell, it was more of a detriment really. Ulquiorra rose a brow. Then why? Rather than him explaining, another voice cut in that left Ulquiorra at a loss for words. Then why is it that you have followed? Haribel asked evenly. Walking up near him, she crossed her arms as she supported the weight of her back against a wall. Thinking back to it now, no one here had prompted you to come along. Rather, you felt it too, didn't you? Something inexplicable. That is what emotion is, otherwise we'd all just be empty. Ulquiorra turned his head to the side before raising his hand and charging a green zero. Emotion is nothing compared to results, he said flatly before flicking the glowing orb of destruction in the direction of a building 70 meters to the right. You missed a few of them over there, Ulkshira curtly explained. He then shifted his gaze towards Haribal. Feeling a need to do something, and doing it is completely different, he said as he lowered his arm. Haribal didn't even react. No matter what she would say, there were only 3 words that would matter. You still came, she said evenly. Ulquira said nothing thereafter, turning his attention back towards where it mattered in the direction of the battlefield. Shiro sighed at that moment. He could understand that Ulkshira was just trying to explain things logically, and it was because of this that he renewed his resolve to end things as fast as possible. Haribal, he called. Haribal seemed oddly attentive when her name was called, then again, he could tell that the woman hardly noticed it herself. Could you tell me what you saw in the 12th Division's building again? He asked. No problems, Haribal said before she began to narrate. Upon entering the research facility, she had noticed a variety of experimental subjects within various storage cells aligned against the walls. Similarly, there were cylindrical glass structures filled with supernatant in a type of organism growing from within it. She had hardly paid attention to such things though, since they weren't exactly what she was looking for. Instead, what she paid careful attention to was the deep jagged scars etched into the ground. These were sword marks indicating that some kind of battle had occurred within the space, but it was clear from the finesse of the attacks that this was not a battle between a hollow or Shinigami. Blade weapons had been the main damage dealer, indicating that this was a battle between Shinigami. Further evidence was the unique residual aura of spiritual energy of some type of Kido the Shinigami used. However, why would a Shinigami fight another Shinigami? Haribal paused in her speaking for a moment as she saw that he had fallen into contemplation. The first time he had heard Haribal explain this point in her narration, he already had a suspicion in his mind. After all, he already knew of a Shinigami that wasn't anywhere near as loyal as the man portrayed himself to be in the Soul Society. Furthermore, it was this man himself who had directed him towards the building. Aizen Saushik. Yet what did Aizen intend for him to understand upon him discovering what was in that room? It didn't take long for him to come up with something plausible. The experimental subjects. Although when Haribal had spoken of it, she had glazed over the particular topic as it probably didn't even count for anything in her eyes. In Hueco Mundo, the sight of dead bodies was fairly commonplace. It wasn't something a Vasto Lord like her would ever pay attention to, but when he considered the personality of the captain he had seen take Silent away, and the described experimental subjects in the building, then there was a distinct message implied after Aizen had sent him there. I saved her. It was that simple. If so, then that would mean that Silent may already be safe, or was at least being kept somewhere safe. Concluding up to this point, he let out a sigh of relief. Please continue, Haribal, he said. Haribal nodded. After discovering those sword marks and the general mayhem of the interior, she soon reached a single room that was free from any damage. This was blaring to her, and a signal that stood out in stark contrast with her surroundings. That, and she had managed to catch a lone researcher in the building who she had strong-armed to follow her demands. Therefore, she didn't even take a moment of consideration as she ripped open the door leading into the room and stepped in. Besides, there were only a few things that could harm a Vasto Lord, and she could not sense any in the immediate vicinity. Once inside the room, this was where she had concluded the basis that Silent had probably escaped in the mayhem. After all, Haribal had faintly been able to sense the spiritual energy she had become familiar with in her time spent alongside Silent. Silent had been in this room, and somehow, she had gotten free from her restraints, evident by the broken straps on the examination table. Furthermore, Haribal even observed signs that Silent was in mint condition, evident by the lack of blood in the room as compared to the others. Concluding up to this point, Haribal ended her narration. However, this only left him with more questions than answers. With the injuries he had seen Silent sustain, it was impossible for her to have had been in any good condition without ample time, and he had been quick to give chase. Thus, the time frame should only have had been a matter of hours at the time, or perhaps a day or two of trying to locate her holding area. It was then that a minor detail in Haribal's recollection entered his notice. A lone researcher in an empty lab? No matter how he thought about it, if Aizen had already taken over the place beforehand, why would there be a researcher there to guide the way? It's hard to be perfect. Sometimes you miss things, Kyoka spoke up from within his mind. So that's how it was. The answer clicked as soon as Kyoka spoke, and it wasn't her explanation. Rather, it was the reminder of Kyoka's ability as a Zanpakuto. Then that lone researcher may have had been the captain himself. It was a startling conclusion as he recalled leaving Aizen behind before departing himself. However, it wasn't impossible for Aizen to reach the building first, as he probably had a deeper understanding of the terrain. "Oi oi, bad man!" Sogyo no Kotori called. Unlike Kyoka, who resided and spoke from within him, Sogyo no Kotori adamantly stayed in a physical realm. At this moment, they were tugging at him. "When will Master wake up?" the two asked. Speaking on that subject, he turned towards Jushiro's form. The man was still unconscious, and the volume of his breath signaled that the man was steadily recovering. However, this was only possible because he had prevented any of the other hollows from approaching. This action had garnered some affection from the two boys, but they still insisted on calling him a bad man. At first, he had considered dealing the finishing blow to Jushiro like he had done with many of the other Shinigami, yet something inside him strongly told him not to do so. It was incomprehensible, but now that he thought about it, it was indeed the correct call. As a hostage, Jushiro played a larger role in mediating away any aggressive actions on the Shinigami's side. This was entirely because of Jushiro's history and favorability to others. Not only was he held in high regard towards many in the Siraidai, but he was also a student taught personally by the head commander. Jushiro was a VIP that should have had become a pillar of the Siraidai, but was struck down by the emergence of an incurable sickness. Still, not one person looked down on the man for it. Even from where he, Haribel, and the others had made camp, he could tell that the head commander was glaring at him with fierce eyes. Near the head commander, there appeared two others who were staring at him just as intensely, however it was with a sense of helplessness. These two were probably Jushiro's close aides or seated officers if he could recall how Shinigami formatted their ranks. The head captain would not move yet, but he was sure that if he made any actions towards Jushiro, then there would be nothing to stop the fires of the head commander's rage. "We're all gathered except for Starkey, Lilynet, and the other three. I'm not sure on Neeliel's position though," Haribel said. "We'll have to send someone to check up on her, but I'm more concerned about Starkey and the rest. They, unlike Nell, may be deep in enemy territory. Besides, Nell is strong. You yourself gave the evaluation, and I trust in you," he said after glancing away from the head captain. Similarly, the head captain turned to deal with other matters on the side of the Shinigami. Haribel was left stunned for a moment, just standing there feeling a sense of contentment which she couldn't understand. It was at this moment though that he heard the steady sound of footsteps with his reinforced ears. By the sound of it, it wasn't any hollow. Shifting his attention to the left, he noticed a familiar figure that motioned for him to follow outside the gaze of the head captain. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," he spoke to Haribel and Ulquira. Neither of the two seemed to hear him, but he figured that they must have understood his meaning. Walking off, he schooled his expression before stopping in front of the person who called him forward. "Aizen," he spoke a tad dryly. "Well, it's good to see you two," Aizen smiled cryptically. He shook his head. He didn't want to bother with pleasantries anymore. For some reason, the more he looked at Aizen the more he recalled having dealt with someone similar, a priest of sorts. "You saved Silent," he said bluntly. "And fooled Haribel into thinking Silent got away to avoid any suspicions on your end. Coincidentally, if things did go your way, everyone here may have had to stay for far longer than what's necessary. What's strange is that you could have pulled this off far more smoothly by not posing off as a lone researcher to give yourself away. It doesn't matter though, you must have your own reasons." Aizen didn't deny it. "In any case, you still did save her," he spoke ruefully. "And basing everything on your actions, you only have a single purpose in mind." He didn't speak further. He didn't have to. Aizen would in his place. "I can promise you that she's safe," Aizen spoke. "The only thing I ask is that you give me some time, and I can assure you that every single hollow alive within the Siraidai will be able to return to Hueco Mundo. A win-win scenario." Back in the tower, the sounds of sobbing echoed out into the dim-lit space. "Kyokaku, Ganju, the two of you shouldn't have come," Kyan spoke as he embraced his siblings. Around him, Rukia, Orium, Chad, Karen, and Ishida stood awkwardly at the side, none making a noise. You two shouldn't have come, Kyan said again, yet the grip he had on the two siblings only increased as he pulled them in further. It was touching sight. More so for Orium, Karen, Chad, and Ishida, who knew that the only reason Kyokaku had left her home was to verify the truth of Ichigo's words. And now, here lay the proof. The air was heavy and fraught with emotion, yet it was because of this that Kyan acted first. Shuddering, his embrace around Kyokaku and Ganju gradually began to slacken, much to the two's dismay as they persistently clung onto Kyan's arms. Kyokaku, Ganju, Kyan tried to reason, yet the two would hear none of it. He gave a bitter smile to Rukia, who was staring at him before his expression grew resolved and solemn. Go, you all. Get out of here. I can sense that a captain is fighting outside. You may not have long to leave, Kyan said. What about you? Ganju asked, his expression distorting into a mess of reluctance made all the more striking with the tears in the man's eyes. It was natural, though. A man would only cry after the most emotional of things. A reunion with a dead brother could be categorized into this. No one present could ever look down on this expression, for they knew they would be much the same if they were in Ganju's shoes. Kyan's response was only an expression of distress that infuriated the woman that was the closest to him. I say fuck them all. Kyokaku roared out emotionally, swallowing back a sob that was threatening to burst out from within her. The fact that they have you in this tower means that this damn tower. As part of a noble family of the Soul Society, Kyokaku knew that being locked within this tower meant a coming execution. It was just that, she could never have had imagined that the person to be locked inside would be her own brother. Kyokaku cursed again as she looked away. She couldn't understand it. No, more accurately, she couldn't accept it. The grip she had on Kyan increased to the point where her knuckles became white, yet Kyan showed no signs of discomfort. Rather, he quietly placed a hand on Kyokaku's head and began patting it softly. Stubborn Kyokaku. You have to remember to respect your elders or you'll eventually get into a lot of trouble. Her lip quivered as a particular memory flashed across her eyes. In fact, many had already come and gone from the moment she saw Kyan's face. It was the same for Ganju. And all of these memories were pointed towards a single thought. He wasn't dead. He was alive. He was close enough that she could touch him. And he was to be put to death? She couldn't approve of it even if the head captain were standing before her. Hell, she'd probably even toss an explosive firecracker if anyone insisted on it. However, Kyan didn't appear to pay any heed to the emotions in Kyokaku and Ganju's eyes. I can't go, he spoke softly, the sound able to pierce into Kyokaku's and Ganju's hearts like a vile thorn. I've become part of a hollow. The admission was met with shocked expressions. Yet perhaps the most shocked was Kyan himself, as he had thought it was enough to get the two holding his arms to let go. How would he have had known that they would only hold him tighter? His expression stiffened, but to the rest, it looked as if he had been greatly moved. We're going to take you out of here, part hollow or not, Kyokaku spoke lowly, determination swelling in her voice. We are of the Shiba family, and family matters are to be left amongst family. Kyokaku immediately began strong-arming Kyan towards the exit of the tower. This, what the hell? Kyan was perplexed. How did things come to this? All he wanted was to somehow drive everyone out of the room bar Rukia, but it seemed as if his strategy had backfired. He knew his tasks from the very moment Aizen had spoken with him. If everything was to go well, then he would accompany Rukia to Sukyaku Hill and make sure she ended up there. Anywhere else may mean death, as Aizen had not specified. As a protest was about to well out from his mouth, he suddenly felt that he couldn't say anything. It was odd. Staring at his two siblings' expressions, he felt inclined to protect them and not hurt them in any way like he was planning. What the fuck was going on with him? He shook his head. Unbeknownst to him, a reaction was occurring within his body. The surge of the waters and the heavens. Nijibana was stirring. Kyokaku, Ganju, we can't go out like this, Kyan persisted. If the two of you are caught taking me out of this tower, then the repercussions for you two will be unimaginable. Kyokaku grunted. Better us three dying together than dying alone, she spoke fearlessly. Oi, yeah brats. Hurry up and take the Kukaki out of there. The restraints on them seal their spiritual energy, making it difficult for them to move. Ah, yes. Orium said, moving to Rukia's side to give her a hand. Karen took Rukia's other side. I may not be Ichigo, but I can help too. Besides, there's still another person I want to save, and you may know where she is. You too. Wait, Rukia bowed her head low. LT. Shiba is right. It's best for you guys not to get involved. You'll only bring danger to yourselves. TCH, Ishida clicked his tongue. At this point, Kukaki, we're already in trouble, caught with you or not. Chad nodded his head on the side. That being the case, I'd rather you answer a question of mine, Ishida said as he pushed up his glasses. During that night when Rukia was taken away, Ishida had fallen into a state of unconsciousness. During that time, he could vaguely recall the presence of another joining the battlefield in his bleary state of mind. However, he still managed to catch a glimpse, and upon further thought, he finally deduced why the image had stuck with him despite the relative blurs of the rest. It was because he knew the person. He had even trained with her. Ms. Kukaki, you wouldn't happen to know where they may have taken another human, would you? Ishida asked. After all, this other human was a fellow Quincy, and not someone he as a Quincy himself could abandon. Unexpectedly, there was someone else paying rapt attention to Rukia's answer, and that was Karen, whose hands had balled into tight fists. Ishida paid it no notice though. About that, Rukia seemed troubled. The 12th Division's research barracks, Kyan said. Captain Mayuri was the one who had taken her, so it's most likely that she's kept in that captain's lab. Lab. Karen's expression seemed to stiffen, but neither Rukia nor Kyan elaborated further. Enough talk for now, Kyokaku interrupted. We'll have time to discuss amongst ourselves after we've gotten out of here and towards a safe location. Fine, Karen replied, her tone clipped as she brooded silently to herself, a mirror of her older brother Ichigo's general expression. The group quickly walked out of the room and back onto the wooden bridge spanning the distance to the tower and the exit. However, the group was not moving as fast as they should have because of both Rukia and Kyan's indecision on the matter. As Shinigami, they knew their duties, and the exact rules that they had broken. As such, death was already the known punishment. What they would be doing now by running away from it was harming their own self-image. Kyokaku would have none of it, and Ganja would never try to protest it. Under Kyokaku's persistence, Kyan and Rukia were taken halfway past the bridge in just a couple of moments, Rukia unable to put up much of a fuss under Kyokaku's assertiveness and her friend's insistence, and Kyan remaining silent, allowing the group to move at a faster pace. Yet nothing could prepare them to face the crippling spiritual pressure that descended from above. Karen clicked her tongue as she was forcibly brought down to her knees along with everyone else. The sky was dyed red, a torrent of power beating forth strong winds that whipped harshly against everyone's faces. The pressure was malefic and vile, something that had the power to drive others away with its presence alone. Damn it, Kyokaku shielded her eyes and attempted to look for the source of such an energy, but balked upon finally locating it. Evidently, she wasn't the only one. The faces of those present were as if they had seen a monster, and in fact, it probably was. Move to Sukyaku Hill. It's a natural formation in tandem with the Sukyaku that should ward off the pressure, Kyan spoke in the tenseness. Yet, no one replied to him, and no one moved. Petrified under the absent gaze of the towering giant before them. Moments earlier. Any chance we could avoid this? Shunsui called out lazily, yawning into one hand. Yeah right, a Pasai sneered. Like we'd run away from a Shinigami. Exactly, Mila Rose followed swift. Your kind always attack ours, so it's only natural. Is that so? Shunsui leisurely tilted his straw hat. To me, it seems more like the both of you want to indulge in a battle frenzy. Shunsui sighed before he plopped down on the wooden ground and sat comfortably. And of course, it just had to be me to deal with this while the head captain finally takes to the field. How unlucky. Unlucky. Mila Rose scoffed. You're lucky you're not facing Lady Haribel or Shiro, perhaps even Starkey. Haribel, Starkey, and Shiro? I'll have to remember that if I can. Stronger than you, yes? Would you like a drink? Shunsui inquired as he pulled out a small sake container. Mila Rose was infuriated with the response, her mouth opening to reveal the sharp canines within as her hairs stood up on end. Vain vulgarities were threatening to spew out from within her, yet at the point that she was about to burst, she was interrupted. "Stop talking, Mila Rose, something seems wrong here," Apasai frowned. "Oi, you ugly old man. Why does it seem like you're preparing yourself for a vacation rather than a fight?" Shunsui gave a very honest look to Apasai but didn't say anything, his actions were enough of an indication. "Fighting's tiring," he simply complained. "Stop acting so smug," Sung Sun called, hiding her mouth behind a pale hand. "You're as guilty as the other two," she then goaded. "Oh." Shunsui's expression shifted into one of surprise, but did not react much at all. Irritation welled up on Sung Sun's face. It was a first for her to handle such an opponent who didn't seem to consider her on an even level now that she'd become a Vasto Lord. In any case, at least she was better off than the other two who'd already started to become muddle-headed. "It's not as if you'd let us go now that we're in front of you. Rather you have no intention to despite sighting there," she said with a huff. "Found out so easily, huh?" Shunsui smiled wryly. "To be frank, I don't really enjoy this fighting stuff. I'd much rather prefer a good drink, but I can't let you harm my colleagues either. What would you say if I offered to just lead you to my barracks until this whole thing blows over? Who would agree to that?" Apasai said. Mila Rose and Sung Sun were of similar mind. "How unfortunate," Shunsui said as he stood up and placed away his drink. "Then what say we all play a little children's game? Enough with this bullshit." Mila Rose growled before she pounced forward. "If you're not attacking then I will." Shunsui hummed at Mila Rose's approach, slowly drawing forth his blade. "Flower wind rage and flower god roar, heavenly wind rage and heavenly demon sneer, Katen Kyakotsu." The Zanpakuto in Shunsui's hands morphed into two large black and heavily curved Chinese scimitars with silver edges. Promptly, he pointed at Mila Rose, and called out a single word. "White." Mila Rose was completely befuddled, but didn't stop her attack. Shunsui was wide open. The man didn't even seem to be going to put up a defense. "Damn bastard." Mila Rose clenched her fist tighter, her power coalescing into a single punch in correlation to her building fury. Shunsui didn't even seem to put her into his eyes. "Well then, let's see how you are after taking this." The wood splintered beneath her, the sound of flesh meeting fabric echoing out in the battlefield. And at that moment, not only was Mila Rose dazed, but so were Apasai and Sung Sun. But that's impossible," Apasai muttered in shock. Shunsui gave out a small laugh as he stood in his original spot, Mila Rose's fist still planted on his chest where it struck his pink kimono that was over his white captain's haori. "Really now," Shunsui spoke. "It's all just a game. A child's game. Irony, a game of colors." Saying that, Shunsui raised his sword and tapped gently against the white hollow bone armor on Mila Rose's body. "Blug dash." "Mila Rose." Sung Sun called. Neither Sung Sun, Apasai, or Mila Rose could believe it. That gentle tap from Shunsui left a cut that deeply gauged into Mila Rose's body. What trickery is this? Mila Rose grit out through the pain. As impossible as it may be, it had already occurred, and Mila Rose was experienced enough to know when to retreat. Smashing the ground as a cover, she appeared haggardly next to Sung Sun, a hand attempting to close the wound. Shunsui remained standing where he was. "Katen Kyakotsu is a fickle thing," he spoke slowly. "It enacts the rules of children's games and forcibly implements them in battle after one is submerged in its sphere of influence. Irony is much the same. In this color-based game, you say the name of the color you want to attack, and you cannot attack anything else. If the color that you call does not exist on your body, then the damage is minimal even if the attack would normally inflict a much more severe wound. In this case, I called the color white, which is on the majority of both of our bodies. In your case, you struck at pink, leaving barely any damage at all. Meanwhile I tapped on the color white, and its strength is in proportion to the ratio of the color white on me." Shunsui flourished his white haori. "As you can see, it covers a large portion of my body, thus the damage." "How troublesome," Sung Sun spoke. But why tell us this if you have the advantage? Because it's your turn, Shunsui shrugged. And I'm barely ever one to willingly take the initiative. Ho, is that so? Sung Sun said wearily. In any case, she still lifted her finger and charged a zero. Then I call white. Even if the pink kimono was in the way, the blast should encompass everything. I call white as well, a Pasai yelled, charging in at the same time. Shunsui raised a brow before letting out a small smile before he jumped up high into the air, dodging both. Brown, was all Shunsui said again, disappearing and then reappearing behind a Pasai aiming for her brown fur. Shit, a Pasai cursed, turning her body to the side. However, a flash of inspiration hit her as she then decided to raise up her arms, which had white hollow bone armor. Nice move, Shunsui complimented. However, Katen Kyokotsu is a very fickle lady. Who says we're still playing the same game anymore? Takeanai. The expression on a Pasai's face paled as she noticed Shunsui's blade cutting into her arm. No. She twisted her body to escape, but it was already too late. With a thud, a Pasai was sent crumbling to the hardwood, rolling heavily to a stop where she lay breathing heavily, her injuries far worse than Mila Rose's. Yet, a Pasai was strong-willed. Coughing out blood, she still had the strength to stand and make her way over towards Sung Sun and Mila Rose. Curses, Sung Sun's eyes narrowed on Shunsui as soon as she had made sure a Pasai was still alive. The current battle felt impossible. They couldn't even use their numbers to suppress this man with all the tricks Shunsui had up his sleeves. What was Takeanai? Probably a new game, Sung Sun quickly concluded. Still, she waited to see if she would get an explanation. Unfortunately, none seemed to be coming as Shunsui just stood there waiting, a small grin on his face. Injured as a Pasai was, her pride hurt more. Stupid old man, you won't be laughing for much longer, a Pasai grumbled before turning her attention away. Sung Sun, Mila Rose. No need to yell, Sung Sun said. But indeed, that may be our only way. You know what happens if this doesn't work. A Pasai gave a nod while Mila Rose gave no reply, her actions were enough. The three moved towards the air and tore off their right arms, tossing them together in a trail of red spiritual energy that assimilated and merged together. Well, that's new. Shunsui's eyes widened as he used an arm to shield his eyes from the strong winds generated by the towering spiritual pressure that erupted violently around. Everything in the world seemed to freeze in that moment, the spiritual energy of three Vasto Lords fusing into one. And in the stillness, only two words resounded from the shout of three voices calling out together. Quimera Parka. Chapter 23, Soul Society, Part 5. A gentle gust followed by billowing gales. The sky erupted in a shower of red, thin fog-like wisps of spiritual pressure cracking the ground as it expanded out. From those cracks, fissures began to appear one by one, making their way to topple buildings and rip apart barricades set up at the foot of the surrounding vicinity. At the center, hovering in the sky next to the isolation tower, was a tinted mass of coalesced energy that ebbed and flowed, pulsating with swirling energies. Just the feel of it alone could bring a sense of dread, let alone the effects it was already having on its surroundings. Everyone in the Siridi gave pause, freezing as they looked up towards it. Some wore heavy expressions, while others seemed to marvel at the sheer display of power. Numerous Shinigami began to flock towards the area, and even head captain Yamamoto was present in the following group. Yamamoto was not amused in the slightest, in fact, his expression was grim despite his lack of facial movements. With his wooden cane clasped within both of his hands, Yamamoto gave the signal to gather. Not only was it in precaution of whatever it was up there by the isolation tower, but because he had discovered something. A fleeting suspicion, but it wasn't one he could simply ignore. There was something wrong with the Central 46. Not only did the Central 46 not issue a reply to his request to reconsider about the execution date, but they didn't answer any of Anohana's inquiries. This was odd as communication was the most vital at the moment as the Siridi was being besieged by hollows. Therefore, not only was he following the other Shinigami because of the anomaly in the sky, but because by doing so, he himself can enter the Central 46's building to investigate. As Yamamoto once again stared at the mass of energies, he sensed out with his spiritual awareness. Shunsui Kyoraku. Yamamoto instantly knew who it was that was currently facing that monstrosity. Yamamoto couldn't see it from his distance away, but he could sense fragments of Shunsui's spiritual energy. Therefore, it wasn't long before Yamamoto's mood dipped further when he realized the strength of whatever it was that was moving within the mass of energy. That black hole-like thing. Suddenly, a furred leg stepped forth from the void, muscles bulging and strands of tinted brown fur moving like fire. Its hoofed feet sent tremors through the ground with but a single step. A wall of dust and debris swept out, pelting all those nearby. Even Kyokaku and the rest frantically making their way towards Sukyaku Hill were affected. Their expressions were stifled. In fact, they were barely even able to move at a walking pace as they like Shunsui were under the most pressure. What the hell is this? Karen muttered as sweat formed over her brow. One of her arms was being used to shield her face as the dust and grime continued to descend on her. It made her black hair gray with dirt. Orium pursed her lips, and didn't reply. It was too hard to when it felt like she would crumple to the ground at any moment. Instead, someone else answered. I don't know, Ishida spoke, clearing the smudge from his glasses as he adjusted on his face. But looking at that thing, it's way bigger than that Minos from before, and its power is simply just dash. Ishida couldn't even finish as Ganja ran into him. Move. Was all Ganja said in a panic. I don't want to be here when whatever kind of hollow that thing is appears. Chad nodded his head as he stared at Karen. Ichigo had made him promise to help take care of her. His body alone was enough to shield the girl from the incoming debris, and she could only thank him with a tense nod. Stop, Kyan suddenly spoke. Damn it Kyan, why? Can't you see that we can't stay here? Kyokaku said nervously. She shifted her weight as she forcibly tightened her grip around Kyan's arm, which she then slung over her shoulder. From the looks of it, she wouldn't let go nor stop no matter what. Stop! Kyan screamed before putting force into his arms, pulling himself, Kyokaku, and a nearby Rukia to the ground just as something zipped by their heads. A long snake tail, covered in glistening white scales, writhed against the ground before lifting itself up back into the air. The snake head at its end dripping down gobs of toxic saliva that riveted the ground in small corrosive holes. Kyokaku stared up in shock, realizing that if Kyan hadn't pulled her and Rukia down, then that would have had been them crushed against the ground. She shivered involuntarily. Kyokaku wasn't the only one though, everyone did as they followed that tail up to the base. From those furred legs that appeared before, the body emerged next. It was bare-chested, abdominal muscles constricting as the snake tail whipped violently back and forth. It was at this point that the coalesced mass of energy began condensing further. We have to get out of her, now! Kyokaku yelled. Saying that, Kyokaku pushed herself off of the ground, and after securing Kyan and Rukia, sprinted forward with everyone else following behind her. Not too far off, and standing just in front of the forming monstrosity, Sung-sun, Mila Rose, and Apasai panted in exhaustion, their right arms eaten away until the base of their shoulders. I feel like shit, Apasai spoke as her mouth twitched. It's always like this when Ayon comes out. Well, it's super strong. It has to be for the amount of spiritual energy we had to feed it, Mila Rose grunted before she moved a loose strand of her hair back behind her ears. Sung-sun. Sung-sun had her eyes narrowed as she stared forward. He's always been hard to control, she whispered softly, yet it was loud enough for the other to hear, making them fall silent. What's even worse is our carelessness. Carelessness? Are you saying you would have rather fled than fight? Apasai said in disbelief. If they had done so, it would definitely reflect badly on Lady Haribel should other hollows catch wind of it. 3 Vasto Lords fleeing from 1 Captain-class Shinigami. Mila Rose was of the same opinion as Apasai, but she didn't voice it, instead just creasing her brows such that it appeared as if she was glaring. Of course not, Sung-sun sneered in anger. Look around you, and tell me what this is. Apasai and Mila Rose gave pause, before doing as Sung-sun said. Oh fuck, Apasai cussed. Mila Rose just swallowed, the sound audible. All around them, they could see waves of black specks converging on their location up in the air by a forming Ayon. These black specks were numerous Shinigami, and amongst them were the white Haoris of Captain-class Shinigami. We're surrounded, with more and more Shinigami on their way, Sung Sun said grimly. If Ayon can't break its way out and is defeated, us three, we're dead. No one said anything as the gravity of the situation sunk in. However, Mila Rose grew increasingly agitated as she stared at Shunsui. After all, Shunsui, despite the surprise and tenseness on his face, didn't appear truly panicked. There was only one thing that it could mean then. Shunsui had some confidence in defeating Ayon. This has to be some kind of joke, Mila Rose staggered. Ayon's the combined power of 3 Vasto Lords. He's way tougher than any single one of us, or even the 3 of us working together. We'll just have to see, Sung Sun said before staring off into the distance. This may very well be the last time she would ever meet Lady Haribel again. Apasai and Mila Rose soon did the same as Sung Sun, a sense of helplessness taking root within them that hadn't appeared since the time they evolved. At this moment, all their hopes were on their creation born through Chimera Parka. Ayon. After the body, the head appeared with a deafening roar that reverberated throughout the area. An untold number of Shinigami who weren't expecting it, collapsed on the ground, groaning in pain as blood dripped from their ears. Even worse, when the roar reached the ears of the other hollows in the distance, they began howling in tandem. An eerie atmosphere descended over the vicinity, so much so that Orium began trembling while clutching onto her hairpins for comfort. It would do her no good even when Kyokaku urged her to move faster. From the head, 2 long antlers stemmed from the deer skull at its center. Sleek and pale, those antlers jutted out from the left and the right and branched out into sharp ends. Pale yellow eyes could be seen just beneath the antlers, the entire head covered in a mane of thick and coarse fur. There was a silence as Ayon fully appeared, heralded by an explosion of spiritual pressure that flattened the area into level ground. The Shinigami beneath were panicking, but the man facing Ayon himself was calm. "Oh, quite a looker, aren't you?" Shunsui said casually, one of Katen Kyokotsu blades propped against his shoulder. Ayon didn't respond, and instead just tilted its head as if confused about what it was supposed to do. "Ayon, attack, you idiot!" Apasai yelled. All Ayon did in response was to yet again tilt its head to the side. "What kind of hollow is this?" Shunsui muttered in befuddlement. He shook his head moments later before he decided to strike out, his mood souring as he thought about how Juakairo was nowhere to meet him at the decided location. With the hollows running around the Siriti and with the knowledge that Yukatake was ill, Shunsui's worries were beginning to make him serious. "I have no more time to play," Shunsui spoke before disappearing. Moments later, a cut pierced through the side of Ayon's waist, spewing forth a torrent of blood. "Ayon!" Apasai yelled in a frenzy. Sung Sun and Mila Rose were more reserved, but the worry in their eyes was apparent. "Fool," Mila Rose muttered. "That attack will only make Ayon mad." "And so what if he's mad?" Shunsui turned to look in Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose's direction. "You won't like him when he's mad," Sung Sun responded. Shunsui rose a brow before his expression stiffened from the overbearing surge of spiritual pressure behind him. "Well fuck," Shunsui cursed as a bloodied hand appeared at the edge of his vision. Shunsui hastily put up a guard, but the impact of the attack sent him careening away through 2 entire buildings. Seeing this, the expressions of the Shinigami watching grew pale as they saw one of their captains being smacked away. Blood threatened to spill from Shunsui's mouth, but he forced it back down. "Okay, that was my fault," Shunsui spoke as he pulled himself out of the rubble. "But you didn't have to destroy my favorite shirt." "Katen Kyokotsu," Shunsui spoke lowly before charging at Ayon. In the distance, Yamamoto watched silently. Like it or not, the behemoth that appeared deep within his defensive ranks would be a problem that would not fix itself without intervention, but Shunsui should be able to handle it. Fluctuations of spiritual energy exuded from the area in waves. Seeing that the surroundings Shinigami may get caught up in Shunsui's battle, Yamamoto called back the other Shinigami nearby. Some were still trembling in fear, while others were now looking at Shunsui in anticipation. The difference in size between Shunsui and Ayon was vast. In fact, Shunsui was currently cutting away Ayon's arm while running up its length. Yamamoto closed his eyes and turned away. This battle wouldn't take long. Although Yamamoto could feel that Ayon's spiritual energy would not in any way lose out to Shunsui's, it was too immature. Like a newborn child even. The way it had tilted its head absently at the start was enough of an indication. Now this battle was akin to a child throwing a tantrum vs an adult. Indeed, as Shunsui was working his way up Ayon's arm, Ayon fired off a zero, destroying its own limb in the process. Ayon, what the hell? Mila Rose finally couldn't take it anymore. We have to help. How? Sung Sun said while panting, her face pale. We don't have enough spiritual energy to interfere. Damn it, Apasai clenched her fist. We still have to try. Yet at that moment, the light in Apasai's eyes seemed to wither. Ayon attacked with another zero that fired off into the distance, but it was split in half by a sword of flame. Head Patain Yamamoto had arrived. That's enough, Shunsui, Yamamoto spoke. End this now before we sustain any more casualties. Shunsui tilted the straw hat over his head, and then gave a prompt nod. Ayon, watch out. Sung Sun's warning came too late, and the last thing Ayon saw before its head was separated from its body was the concern in its creator's eyes. Like a child seeing its mother for the first time, it howled in sorrow, a hand attempting to reach out. It couldn't die. Couldn't die. Arrayayay. Ayon screamed. Its eyes widened, and a mouth full of teeth appeared in view. Using its falling momentum, Ayon attempted to swallow Shunsui whole. And if that failed, its beheaded body made another attempt at crushing Shunsui within its fingers. So even a monster can show feelings, Shunsui muttered while placing strength into his grip. Even still, this is the end. Ayon. With a flash, Shunsui appeared on the opposite side of Ayon while sheathing his sword. Collapsing to the ground, the hollow that caused all to look in its direction began to fade away into particles of spiritual energy. At this moment, all the Shinigami present turned to stare coldly at Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose. Lady Haribel. The three resigned themselves, but they wouldn't give up without a fight. Yet even before that, a piercing bloodlust froze everyone present, all looking towards the defensive line the Shinigami had set up, and the spectacle that would engrave itself into their minds. From the very moment Ayon appeared, Shiro knew that something was wrong when Haribel stiffened. This point became even clearer when Haribel explained what Ayon was in a low whisper, her hands balled into fists. It was a creation born through the sacrifice of Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose offering up their right arms. This isn't good, Shiro observed. With the way things are going right now, Ayon is going to attract an absurd number of Shinigami to Apasai and the rest. It's even worse than that, Haribel admitted. To create Ayon in the first place, they would have to use up a substantial amount of their spiritual energy, leaving them with barely any. Haribel fell silent. She didn't need to explain what would happen if they didn't intervene before it was too late. Surrounded as Sung Sun and the rest were, there was no way that the Shinigami would let 3 Vasto Lords go. They would kill them. Because of this, Haribel had made up her mind about her course of action. She would move to save them, or sacrifice herself trying. The spiritual energy around her began to lift piles of debris into the air, and yet even before she could move, a hand grasped gently around her arm, jolting her. She looked towards Shiro, who was staring straight back at her, their eyes locking. It was like she was staring into a sea, calm and tranquil. It seemed to have an effect on her mind, making her stop in her tracks, her spiritual power receding. Meanwhile, Shiro didn't utter a word. His intentions were conveyed by his actions. The hollows that had come with him were still scattered, and not many knew that he wanted everyone to regroup. Now that he knew from Haribel about Ayon, he clearly understood that Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose were in danger. If Aizen could be trusted, then it could be reasoned that Silent was safe. Therefore, all he would have to care about was the safety of Sung Sun and the rest. And for that, there was strength in numbers, and it would give them the power to save the 3. After seeing the effect Ayon had on the Shinigami, he knew then what he had to do to gather the remnant hollows. He would let all witness a grand spectacle. Looking at Haribel, he nodded his head. He would save them by reaching the heart of the battlefield. Opening his hands, he clenched them around the hilts of 2 swords. Kanshou en Bakia. Without another word, he began running forward straight into the Shinigami's defensive lines. His movements were too quick to be noticed by the Shinigami, and as such, blood began to flow like a river. Yet he did not stop his drive forward. Stunned, those hollows behind him were momentarily at a loss before Haribal followed suit. The two pushed forward, like twin daggers piercing into the lion's gut and twisting. These Shinigami were no pushovers, but even then, Shiro cut them down regardless, Haribal right behind him. It was a veritable storm, and at that moment, a single voice resonated from amongst the hollows. The time has come to end this dispute between the Shinigami. No longer will we suffer from their oppression. Charge! It was like a broken dam with the water seeping forth from a single source before completely bursting out. What started out as just Shiro and Haribal pushing their way into enemy lines turned into a loose arrow flying throughout the battlefield. For each Shinigami put down by Shiro, more and more hollows and Shinigami alike began to take note of the situation. 2 became 10, then 10 became 100. More and more hollows were flocking, their combined appearance like a plague of locusts descending and beginning to run out of control. Defend! The Shinigami cried before they were drowned out by an even bigger roar. A bear-like hollow at a distant corner of the Siriti smashed aside a Shinigami before pausing and looking to the east, its ears perking up. Fellow hollows, look! Gather, gather together! The king charges! Follow the king, our Lord Vasto of White! Howls began to sound from throughout the entirety of the Siriti. Shiro, Haribal warned. The group they were attacking with had inflated to past 300, but the enemies before them were only becoming more and more numerous. In fact, they were only 50 meters away from exiting the minimally defended neutral zone. To reach Sung-sun and the rest, they would have to enter the area controlled and fortified by the Shinigami near the center of the Siriti. 40 meters. 30. 10. Tensions were running high, walls of defensive Kidu erecting themselves in the air. 5. 4. Prepare yourselves. Haribal warned. 3. 1. Trace, on. Spears, swords, and daggers, pierced through the defensive Kido barriers as if they were butter, screams falling short as pieces of shrapnel exploded out and pelted outward and bore holes into the ground. Stray shots of offensive Kido even found their way to batter against Shiro's chest, charring the outer flesh black, but Shiro didn't so much as flinch. Instead, he pressed on forward, shrugging of injuries and countering with his own attacks while at the same time using himself as a shield to redirect the attacks of the Shinigami away from the other hollows. The hollows behind him grew more and more reverent. They had seen the sheer amount of blood bathing their king, and the innumerable number of corpses that lay at his wake. Even if he was injured, he pressed on. A flame of dark blue flickering magnificently in the battlefield. So long as that flame continued to charge forward, they would follow indefinitely. For he was the king that earned their respect and veneration. Even if it was for someone other than himself, he would still suffer for another. No matter the cost, no matter the casualty. For him, they would risk it all for one, and die as one. This sense of camaraderie was never before seen in hollows, and it was devastating. And all of this was a result of one individual steadfastly remaining at the front bearing the brunt of all dangers. He who stood unwaveringly at the forefront, leading the charge. The king, the Vasto of White. The king, the Vasto of White. Not one hollow could say who exactly began the call first, but it was quickly assimilated into the very beings of these blood-stained hollows. They no longer feared death, for it was an honor. Their strength and their dignity were given to them through his efforts alone, and they would feel no regrets perishing for his cause. Hollows stabbed straight through and dying by numerous Zanpakuto, willingly hurled themselves into groups of Shinigami where they set themselves off with Zeros using all the energy they had left. Blasts of emerald gold, teal blue, and vermilion red detonated everywhere, showering the battlefield in gore, broken swords, and tattered clothing. And yet, the charge didn't relent in the slightest. Instead, it became even more heated. For no matter how injured the other hollows were, there was always that broad back to look towards. I am the bone of my sword. The voice which carried out for miles made the hollows' eyes turn bloodshot, the aura of bloodlust they were exuding increasing exponentially. Elsewhere, numerous other groups of hollows were gathering by the dozens, all staring at the spectacle before them in silence. Even other Vasto lords were affected by the atmosphere. The valiant figure of a centaur stood above a hill in the distance from the Siriti. Still bruised and battered, it didn't stop this woman from fighting. And that spirit alone was enough to gather the various other hollows standing behind her. Those who follow with me, I can't promise that we'll all make it out of here alive, but if you don't die even after all of this, then you've become a powerful hollow. Nell's shout echoed within the ears of every hollow, behind her. Neliel Tuadalshwank takes to the battlefield. Charge with me, for the Vasto of White. Elsewhere. Lilynet. Lilynet pursed her lips staring down at the conclusion of Ichigo's fight with Renji. Ichigo was bleeding profusely from numerous cuts on his person, yet in the end, he had come out victorious after showing his resolve. Stark sighed seeing Lilynet's expression. And in the end, Stark ended up carrying Lilynet and an unconscious Ichigo away with him. Thanks, Stark, Lilynet spoke softly. Stark just grunted, a look of seriousness in his gaze as he zipped towards the spectacle of the charging king. Now was no longer the time to be lazy. Elsewhere, and much further away from the battlefield, a Garganta split the skies open. My king, I have returned. Brand stretched his wings, but stared back behind him. He didn't like how he had to rely on his king's enemy, but now wasn't the time to think about that. Regardless of the gaze staring at him from behind, he zipped towards the site of battle. The echoing of steps reverberated within the dark of the hole in space. A skeleton wreathed in a regal purple mantle appeared with an explosion of foul purple energy. In its wake, everything withered away and was reduced to dust. As expected of that fool, Baragan spoke looking at the state of the Siridi and the spear-like charge penetrating its way through. However, it was clear that there was a hint of amusement in Baragan's tone that quickly hardened moments later. Even he was affected by the sheer display of courage before him. He would not be left out from the glory. He raised a hand forward. Go. From behind Baragan, a countless number of hollows stepped forth from the shadows and charged forth. Baragan smiled crookedly before descending leisurely towards the Siridi. You may win the battle, but I will win the war. Back at the center of the charge. Tensions were running high. Even though the Shinigami had set up an entire defensive perimeter far outnumbering the number of hollows attacking, they were still getting pushed back. It wasn't because they were any weaker, the Shinigami's numbers alone were enough to accommodate for weakness, but the answer could not be any clearer to Anohana and Yamamoto's eyes. Fear. It was the lack of courage in the latest generation of Shinigami that was giving way to the attacking hollows. It was the same when that beast of a hollow appeared. Many of the newer generation of Shinigami could do nothing but freeze under such pressure. In this regard, the leadership and valor shown on the hollow's side was of the utmost concern. Yamamoto's eyes narrowed on the one leading the charge. The king, the Vasto of White. Even now that chant still echoed in the air. Above all, that hollow must die. Yamamoto couldn't let this kind of leader of hollows to live. Hollows by themselves could already pose a handful to an entire group of Shinigami, but if those hollows themselves acted as a group, or even worse, developed a chain of command, it would be an outcome that could give rise to a power that could threaten the Soul Society's very existence. It was not something Yamamoto wished to see happen. All forces, hold your positions. Yamamoto ordered. Captains, stand at the ready. With a few words, Yamamoto did his utmost to maintain the defensive. It wouldn't be enough though. Zero. A massive blue beam obliterated an entire defensive line. A Vasto Lord carrying a child and an unconscious teenager, stood with a hand outstretched, smoke still rising from it. Farther off in the distance, two more large groups of hollows could be seen converging on the location. Each seemingly led by other Vasto Lords. Steel is my body, and fire is my blood. The voice of the King of Hollows drew nearer and nearer. Clink. It was the sound of swords being drawn. One by one, the swords carried around the waists of each Shinigami seemed to be trying to convey something to their wielders, yet none could understand the meaning of the words spoken. The Lonely Hill. Bang. With a thundering blast, numerous Shinigami were swept aside as a figure appeared in the distance. The king, the Vasto of White. A booming noise akin to a war god's cry drowned out all the noise. It was at this time that Yamamoto and all the captains had a clear sight of the leader of hollows they were facing, who was now right before them. And with it, they seemed to see an endless world of flame and steel flash across their eyes as the king, the Vasto of White pierced a line straight through their ranks. And within that world, numerous pairs of eyes stared back. Stare too long at an abyss, and the abyss will stare straight back at you. At that moment, every Shinigami seemed to freeze, their expressions one of shock as they turned to look at only a single thing. Meanwhile, a voice spoke in the silence. Sung Sun, Mila Rose, Apasai. When the sound of that voice entered the trio's ears, it was hard not to see the visible relief that fell upon Sung Sun, Mila Rose, and Apasai's faces despite their position being surrounded. Yet, for some reason, although Haribel was happy for Sung Sun, Mila Rose, and Apasai's safety, a hint of irritation flashed across her eyes when she realized the flush on Apasai and Mila Rose's faces. This irritation became even more prominent when Sung Sun shied away from the king's gaze, appearing demure. Haribel, for her part though, was able to put aside such emotions and instead focused on what was happening. From the silence, it was clear that there was something wrong with the Shinigami. After all, not one Shinigami made a move to stop Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose from making their way over. Instead, they just stood there rooted, eyes glued to their hands. Because there, firmly held within them, their Zanpakuto were trembling. Chapter 24, Soul Society, Part 6. What madness was this? It was the same for every Shinigami staring forth at the monster before them. Covered in blood, wounds, and cuts that were already visibly healing, this monster of a hollow didn't show any signs of fatigue after such a grand spectacle. Instead, those bronze orbs of his stared daggers into those present as if mocking them for their cowardice. Those hollows behind the Vasto of White were all still emitting a terrifying air of bloodlust despite the injuries that covered them from head to toe. But the Shinigami present weren't mistaken. Just because those hollows looked injured didn't mean that they were no longer dangerous, rather, it was the opposite. Those hollows still alive were the survivors of the charge. The strongest of the bunch, the elite in fighting capabilities. To top it off, there were two other Vasto Lords in the group. One like a humanoid shark, her gaze sharp, and her shark fin blade coated in a layer of yellow spiritual energy that pulsed with power. The other, bat-like, and bathed in a dim green glow that was pressuring the weaker Shinigami to their knees. The newest addition of the other three Vasto Lords wouldn't make much of a difference as it was clear that their spiritual energy had all but been depleted. Yet it didn't matter, for they were now standing defended behind the back of their king, their Vasto of White. From the shaking of the Shinigami's swords, it was evident that the sight that they had just seen previously from Shiro held a great significance to their Zanpakuto. Those eyes. It was just the sheer number of them that Yamamoto and the rest had seen within that world of flame and steel that heavily disturbed them and froze their thought processes. They had never seen anything like it before, but there was something more about it. Something far more important. After all, Yamamoto had a distinct feeling of familiarity at that moment. It was something each respective Shinigami present could understand. One of those pairs of eyes that had stared back at Yamamoto from the depths of that world, were identical to the ones that resided within the spirit of Yamamoto's own inner world. Ryujinjaka. Yamamoto's hands clasped firmly onto the cane he had in front of him, his expression grave. Anohana, Yamamoto spoke in warning. I know, head captain, Anohana replied grimly. Most probably those eyes were Hiren Meru. Toshiro yelled in shock, the young captain quickly analyzing the situation despite his injured state. It was lucky for Toshiro in the previous battle that only an ice clone had been the one to suffer a debilitating attack, otherwise, he may not have been around in longer. Well, isn't this interesting? Junichi Maru spoke, his eyes wide open, and an air of seriousness around him that was generally absent at other times. No other captains that had rallied upon Yamamoto's orders and that were present made any comments. It wasn't necessary as they all now understood what it was that they had seen. In that world of steel and flame, there were a boundless number of Zanpakuto spirits. Putting this matter aside, based on the report Yamamoto had already read, it was clear that it was this Vasto of White leading the charge that was the addressed hollow, the one able to create Zanpakuto. The need to kill this hollow now only grew stronger from within Yamamoto. However, he knew that he would have to act before the other two groups of hollows converging on the location arrived. As if sensing Yamamoto's intentions, Shiro already seemed prepared. Haribel, he called out steadily. Haribal nodded before motioning for the other hollows to reveal what it was that was behind them. J. Jushiro. Shunsui's expression hardened, his body moving forward involuntarily for the sake of his friend. Yet, Shunsui was stopped by Anohana. If Shunsui were to attack, then any chances of rescuing Jushiro Yukatake would be reduced significantly. The situation was now a stalemate. This was exactly what Shiro had wanted, and it was precisely because of this that he didn't bring out Jushiro earlier in the charge. If he had, then both sides would end up in a hostage situation in which the only way to resolve it would be an exchange. Now that Apasai, Sung-sun, and Mila Rose were secured, it was Shiro's side that was at the advantage. Knowing just how many hollows had sacrificed themselves for him, Shiro was now more than inclined to avenge them. However, at this moment, he was more concerned with getting them out alive. And that would mean placing some faith in Aizen, and whatever plan he had to get them out safely. For such a means, he would buy Aizen some time, confident that Aizen wouldn't wish to make an enemy out of him. By the time Ichigo woke from his unconsciousness, the steady pressure of the air on his face was deafening. It felt as if he was falling, but more than that, he quickly realized that he actually was falling, the ground appearing rapidly in front of him and looking as if it would reduce him to paste in his weakened state. He struggled uselessly, trying to move his body, but all his effort only earned him a knock on his already injured head. "What the fuck, stay still Ichigo," a voice entered his ears, yet grew annoyed when he just realized who hit him. "What the hell's your problem?" Ichigo complained as he took a moment to realize that he was being carried within one of Stark's arms. "Can't you show a little care for an injured man?" The wounds on Ichigo's body ached, the dried blood caking off from the smallest of movements. "You're alive, aren't you? Don't you just heal naturally then?" Lilynet looked at Ichigo in bewilderment. It was Stark who sighed as result. Stark knew of Lilynet's ignorance in regard to this kind of matter, as she hardly met with any mortals or Shinigami within Hueco Mundo. As such, the norm when it came to healing injuries would be viewed like a hollow. So long as the hollow was alive and had enough spiritual energy, they could heal most wounds and even limbs with time. This was why Stark didn't stop Lilynet from forcing in her hollow-type spiritual energy into Ichigo. At that point, Stark was just waiting for Lilynet's attempt to fail, as he would rather not have to explain just why humans and Shinigami don't heal in the same way as hollows. Even more so about why it wasn't the best idea to give a hollow's spiritual energy to a Shinigami. Compared to regular spiritual energy, a hollow's spiritual energy was more violent and volatile, reflecting its destructive nature. Mixing that sort of energy in with the calm tranquil type of spiritual energy Shinigami possess would cause a major rejection if not treated carefully. After all, there was a sort of boundary that had to be broken in order to allow for the mixing of the two polar opposite energies. Therefore, even if Lilynet wanted to give her spiritual energy to Ichigo, it would do no good. It was just that, unexpectedly, the spiritual energy Lilynet was injecting into Ichigo was readily being absorbed. This was what caused Stark's eyes to widen, and separate his attention in half from meeting up with Shiro and glancing at Ichigo. It was too much of a mystery. After all, just like a hollow, the amount of energy Lilynet had given him seemed to have the effect of a hollow's self-healing on Ichigo. Under Lilynet's prompting, Stark had even contributed a couple zeros worth of spiritual energy under his own curiosity. The result was an almost instant recovery on Ichigo's end, small wisps of black and red tinted energies swirling around him and leaving only a couple minor wounds on his person. And at some point, Stark even had the impression of a hollow mask forming over Ichigo's. Porcelain-like, with red tribal marks fashioned like a scar over the left eye, it was genuine. Yet, when Stark wished to verify his findings, there was no longer any mask there. It was in that moment that Ichigo woke up while Stark was traveling swiftly. Having blown straight through a defensive perimeter the Shinigami had set up before. "Since when would I heal like that?" Ichigo answered Lilynet's question in outrage, feeling indignant. However, Lilynet curled her lips in disdain. From what she and Stark had just seen earlier, it seemed to her as if Ichigo was messing with her after already taking a considerable amount of her spiritual energy to heal. She turned her head, and began ignoring Ichigo, feeling peeved. Stark though was quickly drawing near to where Shiro and the others were, only, he paused in his strides when he sensed something in the direction of a large plateau. There was a wooden frame erected at the tip, and the land was relatively barren around it. Sokioku Hill was what the Shinigami named the place. However, what drew Stark's attention was a glimmer of a lingering spiritual energy. Shifting his gaze towards Shiro, Stark was able to ascertain that the situation there was at a standstill. Therefore, he had some leeway as to what exactly he should do. Of course, this matter was settled in his mind when he took into account the other group of hollows both Nell and Brands were leading already towards Shiro. His presence shouldn't affect the outcome much, and Stark reasoned that with his power, he could arrive there if anything too out of control were to occur. In which case, he prioritized the completion of their objective in the Siridi in order to get out of here as fast as possible. Unlike Shiro, who had an understanding with Aizen, Stark was still in the mindset of finding Silent. After all, it should have had been Shiro's first priority. Therefore, he altered the path of his movements. Stark? You're going the wrong way, Lilynet said while frowning. I sensed something, Stark said, not explaining much. After all, what he had sensed was the residue of a familiar spiritual energy. It was silence, and it was coming from a cave in the precipice of the hill. Hey, where are you taking me? Ichigo asked. His injuries had stopped aching long ago, and he was growing impatient as he thought about what may have had happened to his friends and sister. Hey, wait up a second, what happened to everyone else? After we separated from them, they left towards the tower over there, Lilynet grunted as if the answer was obvious. Looking there now, it looks pretty lively. It was the exact location where Aion had appeared, and the area was now swarming with Shinigami and hollows with Shiro's arrival. Weren't we supposed to be going there, Stark? Lilynet asked, furrowing her brows. Lilynet, do you not feel it? Stark asked. What? Never mind then, Stark didn't bother explaining. Although Lilynet didn't make much of a fuss about it as she trusted Stark, Ichigo did. Not only was he concerned about his friend's safety, but Karen was in the group too. Put me down, Ichigo demanded, thrashing within Stark's grip. Stark took a moment to stare blankly at Ichigo before just shaking his head. Suit yourself. Wait, what dash? Stark released his grip and Ichigo plummeted to the ground. Ichigo, you idiot. Lilynet's voice trailed along soon after as she and Stark disappeared. Flailing in the air, it was only after a couple of seconds did Ichigo stabilize himself enough to remember trying to form something solid out of spiritual energy beneath his feet. Yet by then, it was already useless as he ended up by the foot of Sokioku Hill, landing on the ground. Cursing, Ichigo pushed himself up, and took a breath. Around him was a thick forest with hardly anyone in sight. However, from his position, he could feel the growing fluctuations of spiritual energy behind him. It was in the direction of the isolation tower Kyokaku had been guiding everyone to. As such, Ichigo could only envision what exactly happened to Kyokaku and the rest. And based on the sight before his eyes, it wouldn't be anything good. Clenching his fists, he flared his spiritual energy before running in that direction, only to stumble when a hand grabbed him from the underbrush. Shut up and just follow me, a voice whispered into Ichigo's ears. As all attention was focusing on the confrontation between Shinigami and hollows down near the isolation tower, Kyokaku and the others had already made their way to Sokioku Hill under Kaien's instructions. After all, Sokioku Hill was made from a type of durable rock that even captains would find difficult to destroy. Therefore, Kyokaku believed Kaien when he said it would be one of the safer places to hide out from the storm that was brewing in the horizon. It was just that they had to find a shelter first. Over here, Karen said while pointing towards a naturally formed crevice at the foot of the hill. Saying that, Karen disappeared inside, only to come out moments later saying that it was safe. The interior of the crevice wasn't very spacious, and it was more a hollow cavity if anything, but at least it could fit them all. Walking inside, Kyokaku gently placed Kaien and Rukia down as the two still had their spiritual energy restrained by a collar tied around their necks. This made it hard for the two to run let alone walk as without their spiritual energy, they were left disorientated. Is this really alright? Rukia asked, pulling her knees to her chest before leaning her weight over them. Then is that you'd rather die, Kukaki? Ishida looked incredulously at Rukia. If we left you as it was, either you'd get killed by the Shinigami, or by the hollows. Here is obviously the best place, as those people out there are monsters. Ishida laughed dryly. To think that I was so confident in facing them till now. It's an eye-opener. Hey, we're not just gonna stay here, are we? Karen pressed. I can understand waiting until it calms down out there, but there's still something I need to do. By the end of this, either the Shinigami have won, or the Hollows have wiped out a good portion of the Siraidii, Ganju said seriously. By then, we'd be lucky just to make it out of here alive after what we're doing. Kyokaku clicked her tongue before taking out her smoke pipe and taking a long drag of it. They can try, but they should know not to mess with Ishiba. Kyokaku's eyes were fierce. If they so much as try to force this matter, they'll understand just how much impact our Shiba clan's cannon has. Karen, Orium said, trying to console the girl who sat frozen in place. Evidently, this wasn't the answer that Karen wanted to hear. What about Ichigo? Chad asked. He had been silent for most of the trek, but now that the group was resting, he brought up the matter that most concerned him. Ichigo was his friend. Chad would have his back, and Ichigo would have his, therefore, they looked out for each other. He should be fine, Ishida answered. Ichigo's tough, and that Vasto Lord went with him, so it's unlikely that they'd just let him die. But how would you know that they would actually help him? Ganju asked. Maybe because of the childlike hollow? She did seem to be on good terms with Ichigo. Orium supplied, her arms crossed in thought. A child hollow, Lilynet? Rukia questioned in surprise. Yeah, that was her name exactly, Orium said with a smile. Although she's a bit brash. Why would she come here? Rukia pondered to herself in the silence that soon followed. Sounds of explosions ripped across the sky, shouts and screams occasionally drifting through the opening of the crevice. It was enough to cause shivers to run down the spines of everyone present. As time went on, Ganju and Kyokaku fell at peace by Kyan's side. The siblings huddled close together in a fashion they had not done since their childhood. Kyokaku had her body leaned up against Kyan, and her chin nestled against his shoulder. Meanwhile, Ganju sat to the side, leaning his back on Kyan's other side. Rukia and the rest were seated opposite to Kyan. Karen brooding in the corner while Ishida, Chad, and Orium discussed what they would have to do when the fighting outside was over. After all, they were like rats scurrying in a battle between behemoths. If they didn't think things out carefully, then they may very well get flattened. It was only when time seemed to pass on endlessly that Kyokaku stirred, her ears perking up as her spiritual awareness detected something. She pushed herself off from her place by Kyan, her movements alerting everyone else that something was wrong. Sis? Ganju inquired. Kyokaku only rose a hand in response, motioning for everyone to remain quiet. There. Her eyes widened as she felt that sensation again. This all but confirmed it. Someone's coming, Kyokaku said seriously. And this isn't someone we can beat. The spiritual energy I can sense is like an ocean that could crush us all with but a thought. Why, you can't be serious? Ganju asked incredulously. Why would someone like that care enough to seek us out? Kyokaku hushed Ganju down again, but it was clear that Ganju wasn't the only one nervous. Everyone else was too, their expressions tense. Even Orium had her hands to the hair clips on her head in preparation for conflict. We don't know if it's us that they are after, Kyokaku quickly tried to reason. Maybe they are just passing through. After spending time in the crevice, Kyokaku and the rest had already been masking their spiritual energy to the best of their ability. Therefore, if the approaching stranger still moved in their location despite their precautions, it couldn't be any clearer about the stranger's intentions. Indeed, Kyokaku's expression hardened when not once did this stranger seem to veer away from their location, but how? She was sure that there was no one watching them when they were retreating from the area. It didn't make sense unless it was a highly skilled operative of the stealth force or some new Kido. She shook her head. It didn't matter how anymore, just that someone extremely powerful was approaching. It's coming, Kukyuko warned. Everyone out, we'll be sitting duck if we stay in here. As she was talking, Kyokaku was already moving to support Kyan on her shoulders while Chad supported Rukia out of the crevice. Once outside, Kyokaku immediately issued everyone to begin fleeing, yet even before then, the smiling visage of a man appeared before Kyokaku's eyes. Aizen Saoshik, why you? Kyokaku's voice cracked as it shifted into a snarl. When Kyan had first been reported dead, there was no way she would not do any digging regarding the matter. And lo and behold, she found nothing substantial. However, any leads she ever found always led to one individual. Aizen Saoshik. Thus, how could she not have had been suspicious? Even now she could vaguely recall the nights Kyan had spent in his study going over random reports, most of which detailed the rise of Aizen. Yet, there was no proof that it was Aizen, so she was forced to drop the matter in the past. Now though that she had found Kyan again, and Aizen was then the one to appear before her, she didn't need any proof any longer to know that Aizen was involved in Kyan's supposed death. You bastard, Kyokaku seethed. However, she didn't make any sudden movements as like it or not, Aizen was far stronger than her. Well, hello to you too, Miss Shiba, Aizen spoke politely. However, I do believe that your actions can count as treason to the Siriti. If you would please return the prisoners to me for them to undergo their judgment, it would save the trouble. Hearing Aizen's words, everyone tensed, making it clear that they would not be handing over anybody without a fight. I'm a Shiba, one of the 4 noble families of the Siriti, and I file for a court meeting, Kyokaku said sternly. There's no way I'll allow this ruling by the Central 46 to pass. Aizen smiled. The thing you have to understand, Miss Shiba, is that I'm not giving you a request, but a statement, Aizen said while suddenly disappearing. Everyone was left dumbfounded. The speed in which Aizen exhibited was not something that anyone at their level could keep up with. It wouldn't even be a fight, and this knowledge was clear to everyone. However, that didn't mean that they gave up. A bow of light appeared in Ishida's hands, while Chad's right arm shifted into the right arm of the giant. Skin color fading black, a long strip of red ran down the center of Chad's arm followed by 2 white stripes. As for Orium, an orange shield appeared just in front of her, Karen, and Rukia who Chad had placed down near her. Kyokaku and Ganju each had their own set of bombs that the two could use. Ganju's were round, and already lit, while Kyokaku seemed to be holding onto a special kind. Everyone was vigilant, but it would do them no good. They weren't at the level to even meddle with Aizen. Instead, it was like an adult dealing with a child. Ah! Rukia screamed, the scenery around her rapidly changing until she realized that Aizen was currently holding her by the scruff of her neck. Behind him and sprawled on the ground was Kyan. That wasn't so hard now, was it? Aizen said calmly. Kyokaku's face paled, the grip she had on her bombs causing her knuckles to whiten. Her eldest brother had been taken away before, she wouldn't allow it to happen again. Yet just before she was going to act, Aizen moved, pulling Rukia along as a sharp sword intent caused the captain to dodge. They came in a gust of wind. Pink flower petals drifting into the area like a storm. Floating gently, it was a dazzling sight. The kind only ever seen on the blossoming of sakura trees. Footsteps echoed into the ears of those present. They were not loud, nor too soft, but were instead refined and graceful. Like a water lily drifting along a still pond. A sword is only strong when it possesses conviction. Eyes as sharp as daggers narrowed in an unwavering show of determination. A faith and love that would never fade despite a cold exterior. A will made from a promise. Bound by duty, but held up by honor and emotion. A conviction that would last for an eternity. And a hard voice that spoke of it all. Release my sister. Chapter 25, Soul Society, Part 7. One by one, hollows began to converge on Shiro's location. Each new hollow caused Yamamoto's and the others' expressions to harden until it became difficult to differentiate them from statues. After all, the hollows that had arrived had similarly pierced a path through the Siriti's defenses. Nell for her part was leading her group of hollows like a stampede, trampling her enemies beneath spiritually enhanced hooves. Her lance held securely in her hands, releasing tendrils of spiritual energy forward and reduced those in her path into ashes for her to pass over. The hollows behind her cheered in her praise even as she appeared next to Shiro and Haribel's side, completely won over by the strength Nell had displayed as she like Shiro paved them a path forward with little resistance. After all, most of the captain had already been gathered by Yamamoto, leaving those defending to be the weaker sort of Shinigami. The warpath Nell and her group had taken was quite apparent, blood and gore splattered from the weight of the hollows passing. Ordinary Shinigami who saw such a sight instantly became lightheaded and helpless. Baragan, though, was even more tyrannical. Nothing remained in his way except the blackened remains of what were once glorious spires and barracks, now nothing more than a figment in time. Despite moving by himself at the back of the group of hollows he had sent forward, Baragan alone was drawing a significant portion of the captain's attention. Where he walked, there was death. Where he breathed, there was only age. No Shinigami that approached him left even a single trace behind, as the process of their skin rotting away from their bones was visibly evident to all those watching. In front of Baragan's eyes, there was no clear path to take, and no defenses that could stop him. Kido, Zanpakuto, buildings, nothing mattered in his disinterested eyes. Only the path ahead of him mattered, but even then, unlike Nell, Baragan was walking at a leisurely rate. He didn't even care if there was a wall in front of him, or even an entire barrack. He would simply raise his hand and give a simple touch before the entire thing disappeared as if it were never there. Different from Nell, the Shinigami that met Baragan were far from just lightheaded and helpless, they were terrified. Nothing they could do would work, for everything ages and deteriorates. For though he traveled as a single hollow, he alone met the least resistance as he continued forward. By his pacing, it would take him far longer to reach Shiro than the others Baragan had already sent ahead. In fact, Brands had already fallen to stand dutifully behind Shiro's back. Yet Baragan was just beginning his path through the Shinigami's defenses, causing dark lines to form over Yamamoto's brows. If Shiro was the highest priority to kill in the Shinigami's eyes, then Baragan was undoubtedly the second. Truly the act of a hollow, Kaname Tuan spoke towards Shiro. To hold over the life of a fellow Shinigami over our heads instead of a head-on confrontation. Shiro looked impassively at Kaname before speaking. To take one of our own and expect no repercussions, what does that make you? Kaname fell silent after the response as Seijin Komamura stepped forward. Enough talk, Hollow. It's clear from your actions that you are far from valiant yourself. We had only taken one of yours, but how many of ours have already perished? Apasai snorted from her spot, recuperating by Haribal. Clearly, not enough, Apasai said through gritted teeth. Apasai's answer caused a growl to come from Seijin's mouth, but a movement from Yamamoto silenced everyone. Most of the captains were reassured seeing Yamamoto act, but it was only Shunsui who remained tense. After all, Shiro still had Jushiro in his possession. You know clearly that this situation is unfavorable for the both of us, Yamamoto began. Although it's evident that our side is losing out more in this exchange, but that can also be contributed to the fact that the brunt of our strength is already concentrated here while yours are not. In this regard, we are still fairly even, however, this is not Hueco Mundo. A startling spiritual pressure descended on the hollows, forcing a few of them to crash to the ground while the majority of them were trembling on their knees. Yamamoto's eyes were wide open, a seriousness on his face that he had not displayed in decades. Impudent hollows. With a thump of his cane, a blazing inferno had appeared in the sky stronger than that of even the sun. The might of the Siritii has been tested and proven to defeat hollows like you. Do you honestly think that this time would be different? Yamamoto's spiritual pressure only increased with his words. Portions even affecting the allies around him. Almost all the hollows of Ajichas and lower plummeted to the ground, and struggled to remain on their knees. But the king still stood standing, seemingly unaffected. Shiro nodded towards Haribal and Nell, and then placed Jushiro just in front of him. Harm him, and you will not see the light of Hueco Mundo's moon ever again. Yamamoto's tone was clipped, and Shunsui was radiating a deathly aura. Shiro didn't care. The two children he could see in his periphery were staring at him earnestly, but weren't doing anything, seeming to understand something as they jumped on Jushiro. Staring silently at him, the two children gave a nod before waving a silent goodbye. At that moment, a shadow quickly snatched Jushiro from in front of Shiro as his hand was still stretched out. Nell's expression immediately soured seeing who it was. You're not dead, so iPhone spoke in astonishment towards Nell. Certain death was it? Cleary, it doesn't meet expectations, Nell taunted, causing so iPhone's eyes to narrow. Jushiro was in Soifon's hands, and no sooner than when Yamamoto and Shunsui realized this, that all their reservations disappeared. Shunsui instantly appeared next to Soifon and took Jushiro into his hands before retreating a safe distance away. As for Yamamoto, a wave of fire would be too underwhelming to describe it. It was an ocean of flame, that which could reduce all into ashes. And even then, it didn't appear as if the man had put much effort into the attack, a simple tap with his cane. It was truly a show of power. And indeed, it was affecting the Hollow's morale. The heat coming off of it was already enough to melt steel, and the Hollows pressed to the ground felt as if they were being baked alive. The attack wasn't even directed towards them, but they still felt its effects. Just from this alone, it was enough of an indication about what would happen if Yamamoto decided that he wished to deal with them. They swallowed slowly, eyes riveted to the form of their king who stood unmoving. Haribel and Nell stood behind him, and not too far off was Ulquiera and the other 3 Vasto lords watching form the side. A single hand to part the sea. That hand exhibited a concentrated burst of a towering spiritual pressure that seemed to contain the entirety of the flame within its palm. Thereafter, the flame was extinguished with a single squeeze. Embers trailed to the ground, creating flames that caught fire from atop the ruined rubble of the destroyed infrastructure. The sky, a fiery red, was reflecting within those deep and unmoving bronze eyes. It left the Shinigami staring at the scene speechless. This was an attack by the head commander. And for it to be extinguished just as easily as the head commander had launched it, what did that mean for the strength the King of Hollows, the Vasto of White possessed? "Are you done, head captain?" That voice was piercing in the silence that followed. Even more so when the sky itself began filling with countless swords. They appeared in the dozens at first, and then the hundreds, spanning to the thousands as the sheer number of them was staggering. The lonely hill. That which was spoken by their very own Zanpakuto appeared in the Shinigami's minds. It was even more so for the captains who had seen the image of the eyes staring back at them. Rooted, all Shinigami and Hollows alike turned towards the sky. It was magnificent. The power exuding from those swords alone causing both a sense of awe and trepidation. This is ether, a powerful energy source available only for one with the power of a god. The words spoken in a council meeting long past returned to the minds of the captains that were present for it. Some of those swords hovering in the air gave off the feeling that they had felt that day. Therefore, they are most likely artifacts left behind by the Soul King. Anohana sent a glance at Yamamoto's direction, only to find the man staring fixedly ahead. She too then turned to find herself freezing in place. Zanpakuto, there's an Apkuto floated amongst the several thousands of swords. Preposterous, Yamamoto mouthed, staring at the floating wooden cane in the middle of the group of swords. Ryujinjaka, Shiro spoke quietly. The strongest fire-type Zanpakuto. The words Shiro spoke rung in Yamamoto's head, seemingly leaving him at a loss. Yet Yamamoto didn't know that Shiro was bluffing. For the majority of the Zanpakuto he had traced, it was only in outer appearance alone. The spirits within the blades had yet to acknowledge him, making it impossible for him to use them. Which was why even now he only traced them from a distance. Even if it was just their outer appearance, there was still resistance. But it would do. The aura from the other swords completely engulfed the other Zanpakuto, making it impossible for the Shinigami to tell the difference from them, and the swords in their hands. He stared at Yamamoto, making sure that the man's attention was on him. Indeed, it was. In fact, Yamamoto was staring daggers at him. Clearly, the priority to kill Shiro had skyrocketed. But it wouldn't be that easy. "How many swords can you burn, head captain?" Shiro said. Stepping forward, every single sword then pointed in the Shinigami's direction oppressively. Not one Shinigami present wished to see what would happen if such a mass of steel were to descend. In response, Yamamoto's flames only burned brighter till the point where they were no longer visible. "Your flame may reduce all to ashes, but will it be enough to cover all of the Shinigami behind you?" Shiro asked slowly, his spiritual pressure increasing exponentially. In the distance, Baragan peered up from his leisurely pace and stared silently at the towering light before him. Other Hollows too looked at that pillar of spiritual power their king was releasing and cheered. "The thing is, head captain," Shiro said while Kanshou and Bakia appeared in his hands. Although you may have thought that it was underhanded to use Jushiro to gain the advantage, the truth is, I never needed him. To Rukia, the scene playing out in front of her was almost unbelievable despite the vice-like grip around her collar. It was even more so when she considered just who it was that was standing up for her. Byakuya Kukaki, Aizen said slowly. I would think that you above all would understand the present situation of the Siriti. Byakuya remained silent, his gaze calm as a swirl of tiny petal-like blades condensed around him and morphed into the form of a sword in his hands. A gleam appeared in Aizen's eyes in the next moment. Shouldn't you still be recuperating, Captain? I'd heard that from LT. I saying that Captain Anohana was far from pleased from your disappearance at the medical wards of the 4th Division. A slicing sound cut through the air as a few strands of Aizen's hair floated towards the ground. Aizen barely even reacted, seeming to take everything in stride. Are you sure of your actions, Captain? You know as well as I that insubordination is punishable by death or life in prison within the maggot's nest. Will you be obstructing me from my duties? Cut the bullshit, Aizen. Byakuya's eyes narrowed as he tossed out something that appeared to be a body of some kind. It was shriveled, skin graying, and eyes hollow sockets that spoke of the surprise the person must have felt before death. This is the state of the Central 46, Byakuya said simply, drawing a gasp of realization from Kyokaku's mouth as she clenched her fists. From the sheer fury she directed in Aizen's direction, it was clear that if Kyokaku had the power to kill him, she would be more than happy to do so. She would make him wish he was never born. Yet the disparity in spiritual power wasn't something that could be bridged by emotions and personal feelings alone. Therefore, she could only release a repressed murmur of rage. Based on the spiritual deterioration of the body alone, its death was far from recent, even before the order to call back Rukia Kukaki from the human world, Byakuya continued, sheathing his blade. Therefore, Captain Aizen, those orders issued by the Central 46, are far from valid. Now release my sister, she will be in the care of the Kukaki clan until the perpetrator can be found. Aizen stared in silence at Byakuya, the smile on his face creasing until it returned to a tranquil calm. Is that so? Aizen spoke, loosening his grip on Rukia's collar and allowing Rukia to drop down onto the ground on her feet. I'm curious though, Captain Kukaki, what made you decide to make a trip to the Central 46? Mayuri Kuratsuke, Byakuya said, expression growing less tense with Aizen's actions. Thereafter, he motioned towards Rukia to come towards him. She did so promptly, standing meekly by his side. Oh, and you were able to come to such conclusions from Captain Kuratsuke? Aizen said, laying a hand to rest firmly on his sword, Kyoka Suijutsu. Byakuya nodded his head. It was already suspicious that he would come to the human world without first sending someone to verify the traces of spiritual energy he had detected in his labs. Furthermore, there was something off about the way the Central 46 allowed his deployment alongside myself and my lieutenant. This only became apparent to me after careful contemplation in the medical ward. There was a tapping sound echoing in the air as Aizen wrapped a finger against Kyoka Suijutsu's hilt. So, you moved towards the Central 46 for such reasons, Aizen mused aloud. Pray tell then, Captain, did you not go because some part of you disagreed with the given orders? Byakuya didn't answer as Rukia's attention fell on him. It was true that that had also been one of his motives. As the head of the Kukaki clan, he like Kyokaku Shiba could have a direct audience with the Central 46 to some degree as decreed by the rules set down by the Spirit King. It was true that he had already done so before entering the human world, but he couldn't help but try again after he thought things over. Lo and behold, he discovered corpses instead of a council. Aizen walked leisurely towards the corpse Byakuya had revealed, picking it up to examine it. Aizen's actions weren't impeded in the least as Byakuya could discern that the man was simply inspecting the corpse to ascertain its validity. However, that reasoning faded completely when the corpse erupted into a ball of flame, and then into ashes. What are you doing? He spoke coldly. Aizen smiled in response before clapping his hands clean from the soot and ashes. I really should have had disposed of these bodies when I first paid a visit towards the Central 46, but I had assumed my helpers competent. Regardless, it doesn't matter. Slowly, Aizen removed his glasses and stored them within his white haori. his entire appearance seeming to change from the natural calm he exuded towards others to become more suave and confident, as if the very world were sitting in the palm of his hands. It was a change that caused Byakuya to instantly draw his sword. Byakuya wasn't a fool, and he could understand the meaning of Aizen's actions even without the man speaking. "You are the traitor," Byakuya said bluntly. Aizen only stared back silently, almost mockingly. "At this point, Captain Kukaki, there's nothing you can really do to stop me anymore." It was a flurry of flowing petals that danced in the wind. Without warning they appeared, sharp and gleaming in the light as they fell in a cascade towards Aizen. Yet almost at that moment, Aizen moved too. Swift and faster than what Byakuya knew Aizen was able to move at, the man disappeared from his location and reappeared a few steps to the left. Byakuya's eyes narrowed. Aizen's speed may very well be faster than his. If so, everything became much more difficult, but it was expected as Aizen was a captain-class Shinigami. "Scatter, Senbonzakura," the words that came from his mouth were like a catalyst, his entire sword fading away into a sea of tiny sharp blades that moved towards Aizen in a torrent. Its formation was no longer like a spear, but an all-encompassing wave. It didn't matter if Aizen had speed. It would mean nothing if the man had nowhere to escape to. "How, naive Captain Kukaki?" The voice that sounded right next to his ear had his hair raising behind his neck. "Impossible." Eyes widening, he blocked the incoming fist with the palm, sending Aizen flying backwards and tumbling against the ground before reorienting himself. "Not using your sword is not the wisest of moves," Byakuya said coolly. "Draw your sword, or this will end too quickly." Aizen shrugged in response after patting the dust off of his clothes. However, Aizen still didn't draw his sword, raising his hand instead. "Kido?" Arcs of lightning-fast spells zipped towards him, yet he could hardly take them seriously. Was this Aizen's idea of a joke, or a simple underestimation? The Kido fired at him were moving at such a slow rate that it would have had been a miracle if he had allowed himself to get hit. He wasted no time at all, ending this farce. Appearing in front of Aizen, he fired his own blast of Kido directly onto Aizen's chest. "What the fuck are you doing?" His brows furrowed as for a moment, it felt as if he had heard a voice. Still, the situation was far from peaceful, and it wouldn't allow him to contemplate too much on the matter. Wisps of smoke trailed behind Aizen's path of descent, his body lying motionless on the ground as his charred skin gave off an unpleasant smell. Yet almost instantly after, Aizen seemed to get up and acted as if he had taken no damage at all. However, Byakuya wasn't one to allow himself to lose the initiative. He left Rukia's side and charged forward. If Aizen wouldn't draw his sword, then so be it. Wait, stop. Byakuya's expression hardened, ignoring all other noise as he focused on the enemy at hand. Some sort of barrier appeared in front of him and Aizen smiling mockingly on the other side. This kind of barrier wouldn't work at all. With a flourish of his hands, he sent a cascade of Senbonzakura's petals to thoroughly destroy the barrier, which exploded and injured Aizen further. This was when Byakuya paused. "Draw your sword, Aizen," he said simply as he watched Aizen get up again. Aizen was injured now. Cuts over his body, and the Byakurai Byakuya had shot into the man's chest still smoking. "Indeed, perhaps I should," Aizen said, drawing forth Kyoka Suijutsu. Based on Byakuya's memory, Aizen had a water-type Zanpakuto. Therefore, he expected it when torrents of water completely surrounded him. Acting fast, Byakuya countered with a cyclone of rose petals that swirled violently around him to dissipate the water. Thereafter, Senbonzakura once again appeared in Byakuya's hands before he charged towards Aizen. Spouts of water like jet streams shot at his approach, but he swerved past them all by utilizing his proficiency in flash step. The surroundings were reduced to rubble, the strength of the water Aizen was releasing boring holes into the ground and straight through the trees and nearby boulders. Byakuya reached Aizen in a matter of seconds, locking blades with the man. He stared coldly as his strength overpowered Aizen's. Sparks fell towards the ground in showers of heat and steel, creating shadows that cast themselves over Aizen's features. Disengaging from the sword lock, Aizen used the moment to stab forward with his sword. It was fast, a movement that should have had pierced any other captain, but himself. After all, one of the aspects he prided himself in was his speed. He swerved just out of reach from Aizen's sword, and stabbed forward with his own, knowing the distinct feeling of his sword piercing through flesh. He had hit his mark. Aizen's body seemed to fall limp, staring straight at Byakuya as blood dripped down the edge of Senbonzakura. It would seem as if I'd miscalculated, Aizen's voice sounded bitter. Byakuya didn't respond. There was no need to when facing traitors of the Soul Society. Yet, Aizen wasn't done talking. Instead, the man was insistent on it. Tell me then, Kukaki, did you not inform anyone else of this matter? A look of resignation appeared on Aizen's face, his brows furrowing as the man forced down a gag reflex caused by Senbonzakura still stabbed through his chest. I alone am enough, Byakuya said coolly, unwilling to admit that he had been too anxious after his discovery at the Central 46. So that's how it was indeed, Aizen said, nodding his head despite the blood leaking from his mouth. Unfortunately, then, Captain Kukaki. Aizen gripped the flat of Senbonzakura and thrust himself further down its blade, such that he was now face to face with Byakuya. Our time is up. The sound of shattering glass seemed to ring in Byakuya's head, before the world around him seemed to morph and twist, stripping away what he thought was reality and replacing it with a bone-chilling horrorscape. Screams seemed to ring in his ears, but he could hardly care at this moment as the grip he had on his sword slackened entirely. Our Rukia! He exclaimed in shock and disbelief after seeing his own blade stabbed straight through the person he had vowed to protect. She was paling fast, numerous wounds on her body that he knew could have had only been caused by him. This wasn't supposed to happen. Brother, why? Rukia's mouth was still opening up and down, a look of shock and despair on her face that hurt more than any dagger or sword. His hands stretched forward by instinct, catching her into his arms as her body lost its strength to stand. That face. That expression. It was all too similar. No, no. Not again, no. He could see her gasping for breath, could feel the warmth of her blood. This wasn't possible. What the hell happened? It was at that moment that Byakuya finally took his eyes off of Rukia to glance around him. The Ryoka, the ones that infiltrated the Siriti at the same time as the Hollows. They were scattered everywhere. Some were near him, and others were much farther, but it was the same scene for each of them. They lay there bleeding and unmoving, clearly in a state of unconsciousness or death. A dull numbness seemed to take root within him before his gaze eventually settled on Kyan Shiba, whose body was sprawled protectively over top his siblings. Out of the three Shibas, the most blood was coming from out of Kyan's own back. The brother was beneath Kyan, and the sister at the very bottom. Out of everyone, only Kyokaka was barely awake, and even then, it was because her brothers had taken most of the injuries for her. Still, she lay battered and wounded, and was completely unable to move. Bits of dirt and grime covered her body from head to toe, making it appear as if she had rolled in mud. Dried tears stained her face, and her gaze was still pointed in his direction, stunning him in what he saw. Because in her eyes was an untold fury. Her mouth was opening and closing, rasping out a cracked voice that eventually exploded on him. Kukaki, you bastard! Check the description for the links to the author.